It's time, so we are starting the 2021 I²CNER Annual Symposium. Thank you very much for participating in the 2021 I²CNER Annual Symposium today. I am Yukina Takahashi from the International Institute for Carbon Neutral Energy Research, Kyushu University, who will be the MC today. The webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to I²CNER's YouTube channel later. At the end of each presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Please type your questions or comments in the Q&A box in English. First, President Tatsuro Ishibashi of Kyushu University will give opening remarks. President Ishibashi, please.
Distinguished guest, esteemed colleague, all the key attendees, good morning. My name is Tatsuro Ishibashi, the president of Kyushu University. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for participating in 2021 Annual Symposium. We are highly honored to have Mr. Toshio Kuroki, Director of the WPU Academy, join us today as our distinguished guest. Kyushu University has actively engaged in comprehensive research on environment and energy, which is a strong and unique field of us, aiming to realize carbon neutral energy society. The core institute of our initiative is I²CNER. It was established on December 1st, 2010 under World Premier International Research Center initiative, supported by Ministry of Education, Culture, Sport, Science, and Technology. It is the International Research Center representing Kyushu University. The year 2020 marked the 10th anniversary of I²CNER, as well as the achievement of obtaining world premier status. We are successfully inducted into the WPU Academy of Japan, ensuring our continuation in advancing the mission and goal of the WPI program. With the worldwide leading researchers as part of core members, I²CNER has made consistent effort for the past 10 years and created global network system and realized worldwide collaboration. In order to solve the energy issue of Japan and the world, I²CNER has vigorously engaged in cutting-edge fundamental research that will contribute to the realization of the carbon neutral energy society. In a post-pandemic world, the global key issue is green recovery. Carbon neutrality is a core part of it. The government of Japan have recently pledged to realize a carbon neutral society by 2050. Now the world is seeing the time of dynamic shift in terms of energy and environment. The initiative of I²CNER is just what the world is looking for, and expectation on our promising effort is increasing. Kyushu University holds this Energy Week 2021 amid COVID-19 pandemic. The theme of this year is Energy Intelligence Beyond Borders, Adapting in a Post-Pandemic Society. We invited well-renowned researchers to give lectures, and I really expect we have lively discussion after that. I truly wish this will provide an opportunity to have our effort known widely. In closing, I wish all the participating organizations continued success and would like to ask for your continued support to our effort as we work toward the further success of I²CNER. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Ishibashi. Next is Dr. Toshio Kuroki, WPI Academy Director, Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Dr. Kuroki, please.
Thank you very much. I am Toshio Kuroki, WPI Academy Director of GSPS. First of all, I'd like to congratulate 2021 I²CNER International Symposium, which is held by Zoom systems, which allow so many people worldwide can join. Maybe they get up very early morning or not so late, but it's still the dinner time. Actually, I'm a breakfast time. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Joe Biden's administration, which has started last week and quickly respond the crisis of climate crisis, and to rejoin Paris Agreement. And also, as a ex-WHO staff members, I'm very happy Joe Biden administration rejoined, United States rejoined to WHO, and Dr. Fauci is a representative of WHO. It's a very, very strong power to combat to COVID-19. Excuse me. The cough is not due to COVID-19, just a cold. Before starting symposium, I'd like to show shortly about WPI program. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So WPI program aims creating internationally open, globally visible, world top research centers. We have 4 missions, very ambitious missions. So first of all, it should be at the level of top science. And the second is very unique. We emphasize the importance of interdisciplinary research. And globalization and system reform is also very important target of WPI grant. WPI program very much interested in basic research rather than application, because we believe basic research is a source of future innovation. And I²CNER was established in 2010 as a 6th WPI center under the program of green innovation. That time I was program director of WPI program. Now we have 13 WPI centers. The subject or target of research can be divided into 4 groups. The first one is very ambitious, origins of the universe, Earth, and life and intelligence. We have 3 WPI centers here. Second large group is life science, immunology, sleep science, and human biology, and plant animal biology and chemistry, and also nanolife science. I2CNER is trying to, it's Kyoto University WPI Center trying to integrate cell biology and material science. The third group is material and energy. You know, I2CNER is one of the important group of these sessions. We have 2 material science or 3 non-material science groups. Most of this WPI center is collaborating or taking division of information science. So these 13 WPI centers are distributed from north to south of Japan island. And of course, I2CNER located here in Kyushu. So supporting period by the government is for 10 years. So first, whole WPI center finished 2000 joined to WPI Academy. Now I2CNER joined to WPI Academy after 10 years achievement. So what is WPI Academy? It's an umbrella organization of WPI centers after termination of the WPI grant. And we hope these WPI Academy centers can be sustained by the host institution and external funding, which include also government. Actually, we have now 5 WPI centers, academy centers, including I2CNER, and these WPI centers, academy centers are doing very well and still holding a top position in basic science. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kuroki. Now, Professor Petros Sophronis, Director of I2CNER, will explain the symposium objectives. Director Sophronis, please.
Good morning, Japan. Good evening, United States. Good afternoon, Europe. I welcome everyone to the 2021 I²CNER Annual Symposium. I am Petros Sophronis, Director of the International Institute for Carbon Neutral Energy Research at Kyushu University in Japan. I'm also a faculty member at the University of Illinois, cross-appointed between the University of Illinois and Kyushu University. As President Ishibashi, President of Kyushu University Ishibashi, has just mentioned, our mission is to contribute to the creation of a sustainable and environmentally friendly society by conducting fundamental research for the advancement of low carbon emission and cost-effective energy systems and improvement of energy efficiency. I²CNER began in 2010, as Professor Kuroki mentioned, as the 6th institute of the WPI, the World Premier International Research Center Initiative by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports and Science and Technology, next of the government of Japan. In our 10th year, as President Ishibashi mentioned, we achieved World Premier status, and we've been successfully inducted in the WPI Academy of Japan this April of last year. And now, recently announced, just a few months ago, Japan's new Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga, set an ambitious goal of carbon neutrality for the country by 2050. He spoke about harnessing the power of innovation and regulatory reform to transform Japan's energy production and usage and that they will be looking at other technologies, such as plants burning hydrogen, in addition to wind and solar. Prime Minister Suga's vision is fully compatible with the mission of I²CNER and what we have been doing in the past decade. We are working to advance the science and engineering of energy systems that will enable carbon neutrality and therefore mitigating climate change. Our research approach and methodology exemplifies the 3E+S policy of Japan: energy security, energy efficiency, environment, and safety. Now, in our 11th year, I²CNER continues to produce some of the world's most exciting research on the future of energy. This is very important, the future of energy. This is what I²CNER's annual symposia are all about. With this event, we have established a tradition at Kyushu University since 2010 to celebrate the research achievements of our thematic research areas, and at the same time to explore and discuss the current state of the art in areas and identify the roadblocks and advances needed to accelerate our progress toward technology development. We are very excited about this year's theme: a virtuous cycle, embedding the energy transition in post-COVID-19 recovery. As we all know, for all of us, no matter where you live in the world, the global COVID-19 pandemic has impacted our societies in multiple ways, which are manifested in tragic loss of life and decreased economic activity and industrial output. It has been devastating for so many. But I believe we are not in a position to waste the opportunities that can arise from challenges such as these. Our scientists and innovators must continue to push for the transition to new energy systems that will help us achieve carbon neutrality, while also enabling our ability to lessen the devastation caused by pandemics and global emergencies in the future. We can facilitate this necessary paradigm shift by unleashing disruptive scientific solutions, reimagining our energy infrastructure in terms of supply and demand, and ensuring the safety and reliability of our energy systems. In turn, the data show that these changes can accelerate economic recovery, create new jobs, shift that which drives our economies, and set in motion regulatory reforms. In short, this energy transition that we will try would see more effective global coordination and collaboration. Our enhanced collaboration will result in increased momentum toward energy transition, enabling us to achieve the 2050 goals and then completing the virtuous cycles, strengthening the 3E+S: energy, economic efficiency, environment, and safety. This is our cycle. We don't let the opportunity to get wasted. We drive innovation. Innovation would drive the economy. We shift the economy. A robust economy can drive the energy transition. It's a virtuous cycle. Energy transition serves the economy serves the transition. Within this framework, in this year's symposium, we will explore the variety of future energy technologies and policy outlooks in Japan and across the globe. And we plan to discuss how investment can be prioritized in energy engineering so we can accelerate the transition to carbon neutrality while at the same time contributing to economic recovery. We have an exciting and informative program to share with you today, with perspectives from around the globe, including Mr. Keiji Hisata from the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy in the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, speaking of Japan's strategy for achieving carbon neutrality. Mr. Ross Matsking-Bridger from the United States Embassy in Tokyo, who will talk about America's energy policy moving forward. Dr. Jill Engel-Cox from the United States National Renewable Energy Laboratory, sharing her perspectives with us on sustainable energy transition. Professor Benjamin McClellan from Kyoto University, and also a research fellow at the University of Queensland, he will talk about Australia's energy supply sector during the pandemic. Professor Robert Gross, director of the UK Energy Research Centre and a professor in the Imperial College London, speaking on the challenge faced by the UK on their road toward economic recovery and clean net zero energy. I'm also looking forward to hearing the brief but interesting updates from I²CNER's young scientists who will share some of their exciting new research. So I'm thrilled to see so many of you here for what I believe will be an insightful day. On that note, I express my gratitude to everyone at I²CNER who has worked to make this symposium possible, my I²CNER colleagues at Co2 University and all over the world, and most importantly, the I²CNER Administrative Office, who continue our 10-year tradition of impeccable symposia organization. To conclude, I will share that with the announcement of Prime Minister Suga's energy pledge and the new administration here in the United States bringing us back into the Paris Climate Accord and the many innovative research discoveries happening within I²CNER and around the world, I believe the future is bright for our work to create a clean energy society. On behalf of I²CNER, I thank you again for joining us today. And I will now turn it over to Professors Takahashi and Klotz, who will introduce Mr. Keiji Hisata for our first presentation. I thank you again.
Thank you, Director Sophronis. We are now starting a presentation session. At the end of each presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So please type your questions or comments in the Q&A box in English during the presentations. First, Mr. Akihisa Matsuda, Deputy Director, International Affairs Division, Agency for Natural Resources and Energy, METI, will give a presentation titled Overview of Japan's Green Growth Strategy. Mr. Matsuda, would you please start your presentation?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Very well.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. I'm Matsuda Akihisa from Agency for Natural Resources and Energy, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI of Government of Japan. First of all, thank you all for making the effort to arrange this timely symposium and invite me to present Japanese government policy in order to tackle with global climate change. Our Prime Minister announced carbon neutrality goal last October. It was a great step to leap forward, but my presentation starts from environmental innovation strategy in February last year, followed by carbon neutrality declaration in last October, and its implementation plan, green growth strategy, and coming revision of future energy mix in Japan. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes. So I start from environment innovation strategy. Needless to say, climate change is the most urgent global issue of our time, and we are at a defining moment. From shifting weather patterns that threaten food production to rising sea levels that increase the risk of catastrophic flooding, the impact of climate change are global in scope and unprecedented in scale. Without drastic action today, adapting to these impacts in future will be more difficult and costly. Environmental Innovation Strategy, EIS, published in last February, aimed to establish innovative technologies that enable the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions toward carbon neutral and further reduction of accumulated atmospheric carbon dioxide level beyond zero by 2050. The strategy set out action plans for establishment of the innovative technologies and 16 challenges in 5 fields. Technologies including CO2 uptake using cement and concrete, artificial photosynthesis, and direct air captures, and so on. As an accelerator of the strategy, the Global Zero Emission Research Center, GZR, was established in AIST, National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology, to connect 120,000 researchers in G20 member countries. GZR can be a hub of aggregated knowledge from all over the world. Dr. Yoshino Akira, 2019 Nobel laureate in chemistry, is the director of Research Center. In order to cooperate with foreign government and the widest variety of stakeholders, METI not only established GZR, but had a series of conferences to realize Global Beyond Zero under the brand of Tokyo Beyond Zero Week in October last year. As Tokyo Beyond Zero Week, METI had 6 conferences: LNG Producer Consumer Conference, International Conference on Carbon Recycling, Hydrogen Energy Ministerial Meeting, RD20, that is Meeting of Research and Development Bodies in G20 countries, TCFD Summit related to Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, and ICEF Innovation for Cool Earth Forum. In those conferences, METI invited many government, academia, and industrial players around the world and presented the way forward global beyond zero. In the LNG Producer Consumer Conference, we announced to make clean LNG cleaner. We made it clear to promote activity to reduce greenhouse gas emission through energy value chain and to produce hydrogen and ammonia from energy by carbon recycling. In the International Conference on Carbon Recycling, METI declares to promote research and development and practical use for social implementation of carbon recycling, discuss the necessity of innovation, finance, and industrial institutional design on carbon recycling. Also, Japan and US government signed a memorandum of cooperation on carbon recycling and CCUS. At the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial meeting, we discussed to maintain and expand the global momentum for building hydrogen-based society. This year, we are planning to have a second Tokyo Beyond Zero Week in this autumn. Our aim to make Tokyo Beyond Zero Week would be a conference like World Economic Forum and so on in the area of energy and environment. I will move on to Japan's carbon neutrality declaration and green growth strategy. In October 2020, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga declared Japan's intention to aim for carbon neutrality in 2050. In the statement, the Prime Minister maintained that this challenge has become the very essence of Japan's growth strategy. Government will fully support the private sector's effort toward carbon neutrality, setting specific targets that enable the private sector to set and achieve ambitious goals. METI, in close cooperation with other ministries, published the Green Growth Strategy last December in order to show the practical pathways toward carbon neutrality goal. The strategy is the implementation plan for carbon neutrality goal and includes 5 cross-sectoral policy tools or support measures and action plans for 14 sectors. The strategies published December is not a rigid one. It will be updated continuously. As I stated before, tackling climate change is an opportunity for further growth. Green growth strategy is an industrial policy towards a positive cycle of economic growth and environmental protection. However, it is not the easy way to realize a positive cycle because substantial changes to business models and strategies are required. The role of the government is to support for the private sector to tackle ambitious goals. Government presents concrete national vision and targets, which motivate business players to set their ambitious goals. The strategy constitutes a list of 14 sectors with high growth potential, for which the government will provide the necessary policy measures and show ambitious goals. I will touch upon 14 growth sectors in green growth strategy. First, offshore wind power, including wind fuel, which can be mixed with coal to reduce greenhouse gas emission in power plant, hydrogen-related industry from turbines for power generation, hydrogen reduction steelmaking, hydrogen carrier ships, water electrolyzers, and so on. Mobility and battery, promoting electric vehicle and fuel cell vehicle, as well as developing next generation batteries. Semiconductor and ICT, data centers, energy saving semiconductors, which contribute to demand side efficiency. Maritime sector, utilizing fuel cell ships, electric propulsion ships, and gas-fueled ships. Logistics, smart transportation, drones, and fuel cell construction machinery. Foods and agriculture, forestry and fisheries, smart agriculture, wooden skyscrapers, aviation sector, hybrid electric or hydrogen-powered aircraft is being developed. Carbon recycling, capturing carbon dioxide and using material for concrete, biofuel, and plastic. Housing and building, and resource circulation and life cycle related industry. Those are the sectors we focused on green growth strategy. In energy sector, the most important part of this strategy is decarbonization of electricity. Firstly, we aim at maximum introduction of renewables. To achieve maximum introduction of renewables, grid development, cost reduction, coordination with local communities, and the use of batteries are required. Hydrogen power is also an option. As for hydrogen, tasks are to increase of supply demand of hydrogen, deployment of infrastructure, and cost reduction. When it comes to global power industry, especially in emerging economy like ASEAN countries, thermal power is essential and inevitable considering the situation of those countries' environment. To reduce emission from thermal power generation, carbon recycling and mixed combustion of ammonia with coal are also an option. Nuclear power is a decarbonization technology with further safety enhancement. We will strive to research and development of next generation reactors while aiming to decrease dependency on nuclear power in energy mix. Apart from electricity sector, we promote electrification in all other sectors. For non-electricity demand, hydrogen use and CCUS are key technologies, including hydrogen reduction steelmaking in manufacturing process. Electrification biofuel hydrogen fuel can reduce CO2 emission in transport sector. In introducing renewable energy, we promote the storage of electricity, smart grid, supply demand response, infrastructure maintenance, and development to implementation to reduce costs through mass production. With simplified calculation, expected economic gain is 19 trillion yen in 2013 and 190 trillion yen in 2050, approximately 880 billion US dollars and 1.8 trillion US dollar by this strategy. Next, I will focus on power generation sector. Electricity demand will increase by 30 to 50% by proceeding electrification. In order to meet this demand hike, we may aim at the maximum introduction of renewables. However, there are many challenges such as assuring power adjustment, transmission, grid inertia, social conditions, power generation cost, and considering current situation, at the time being, we set 50 to 60% renewables in 2050 as a reference, and we'll continue discussions based on the expert and various stakeholders' comments. Not only the promotion of renewables, further innovation needed in thermal power plant with CCUS and hydrogen. For just reference, in energy outlook of carbon neutrality in 2050, 10% is for hydrogen and ammonia power generation, 30 to 40% is nuclear and thermal power plant with CCUS. We will analyze various scenarios further, enhance discussion towards revision of the strategic energy plan. Next, I will explain the structure of the green growth strategy. Development and social deployment of technologies need huge investment. Government will provide all policy measures, for example, funding, tax, regulation, and standard, and so on. In addition, we will enhance international collaboration with the, for example, Biden administration and the EU and ASEAN countries. In the green growth strategy, we developed sector-specific action plans with timeline until 2050. From R&D phase, demonstration phase, scale up to commercial phase, we mobilize all policy measures. Policy focuses are demand creation by regulatory reform, standard setting, and including private financing, and in cost reduction through increase of private investment. Specific measures are tax benefit for capital investment, regulatory reform, including hydrogen filling station, grid rules, and so on. Safety standard for floating wind turbines, and so on, and including private finance, including the rule for financial markets, such as disclosure evaluation. Policy tools to support industry are summarized in page 16. The government proposed Green Innovation Fund, 2 trillion process of approval on Japanese diet right now. The fund will stimulate private research and development and investment roughly 15 trillion yen worth. Tax incentives stimulate 1.7 trillion yen worth of private investment over 10 years. We will formulate guidelines for transition finance and establish a scheme for long-term funds with an interest subsidy to attract global ESG investment to meet investment need for green technology. We also tackle for regulatory reform in areas such as hydrogen, offshore wind power, and mobility and batteries. There are international discussions on carbon border adjustment and related policies. We will consider to discuss with a view to ensuring global level playing field. Finally, since green growth is a global challenge, we will cooperate with various players, including both developed and emerging countries on innovation policy, joint project, including third countries, standardization and rulemaking, and providing wide variety of solutions toward decarbonization. I will introduce some promising sectors for green growth. Slide 18 is about the promotion of offshore wind. Offshore wind power generation is expected to be introduced on large scale and key for making as the introduction of wind power proceed Europe, but rapid growth is expected in the Asian market in the future, especially in China, Taiwan, and South Korea. Currently, most offshore wind power manufacturers are located to overseas, not in Japan, but there are potential suppliers in Japan as well. This sector can be one of the symbolic sectors of green growth. In order to promote accelerate offshore wind power in Japan, METI designated area of Nagasaki as Japan's first offshore wind power generation promotion area in 2019 and started to accept bids from operators last June. Also, designated areas of Akita Prefecture and of Choshi City in Chiba Prefecture as promotion areas last July and started to accept bids from operators in November. In July last year, METI also announced that 4 new promising areas, including area of Happo Town and Noshiro City in Akita Prefecture. As for hydrogen, Japan has taken lead to develop hydrogen society. Government of Japan launched the basic hydrogen strategy in 2017. Countries, including the US, EU, France, and Germany, have launched their hydrogen roadmaps. In the strategy, in the green growth strategy, we aim at the cost reduction $3 per kilogram by 2030 and less than $2 per kilogram by 2050. Hydrogen is utilized as a fuel for mobility, steel producing process, as well as power generation to increasing the demand 20 million tons in 2050. Fuel ammonia does not emit CO2 during the combustion and becomes one of the effective fuels for combating global warming. It can be produced from natural gas with CO2 offset or renewable energy and used as a fuel in coal-fired power plants with minimum modification of facility. Ammonia is one of the hydrogen carriers, but it can be a fuel mixed with coal and used directly for electricity generation as a zero-cost ammonia power generation in coal-fired power plant to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Nuclear energy is a zero-carbon technology. While existing nuclear power plants should be restarted in a prudent manner in accordance with the most stringent regulation, nuclear innovation should be accelerated through encouraging participation of Japanese suppliers with established manufacturing base in ongoing demonstration projects, such as in the US, UK, and Canada. Lastly, I will briefly present the state of play of revision of Basic Energy Plan. Basic Energy Plan sets target of energy mix of Japan in 2030 and revised every 4 years. Now METI is in the process of 6 Basic Energy Plan. In revising Basic Energy Plan, we are taking into account global situation around energy, such as rise of nationalism, COVID-19 pandemic, power balance in the Middle East, climate change issue, and emerging digital technologies. We have to secure stable and affordable energy supply by improving energy self-sufficiency. Also, we have to realize decarbonization while securing supply, stable supply, given the growing international movement toward carbon neutral. We also have to consider the vulnerable energy infrastructure due to natural disasters. The environment is changed by electricity deregulation and expansion of renewable. We have to establish resilient energy supply infrastructure so that we can recover rapidly from natural disasters. We also have to work on cybersecurity in a more comprehensive manner. Steps for revision of basic energy plan is as follows. We will identify challenge for realization of safety, energy security, economic efficiency, and of course, environment, including factors like importance of resilience, and analyze challenges for realization of decarbonized society to set target for 2030 energy mix. METI will lead the movement towards a global carbon neutral goal. Again, we would like to cooperate with all stakeholders to realize green growth and energy security. Thank you very much for kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Matsuda. If you have any questions or comments, please type in the Q&A box. So, from Professor Matsumoto, technologies necessary for green growth listed in a slide have different levels of technologies readiness. How METI and the Japanese government will make investment for such different levels of technologies?
Okay, thank you for that question. Now, as I stated in my presentation, we have to mobilize all policy measures to enhance research and development. The most significant or most symbolic thing is a 2 trillion yen research and development fund, which is a part of the this year's revised national budget, which is now discussing in the diet session. If this fund is approved, we have 2 trillion yen for 10 years, and it can be accelerates research and development in all sectors related to the carbon neutral goal. It can be an answer for your question?
From Dr. Takaotomu Mizutani, any plan to promote geothermal electric power generation?
Oh, thank you for your question. As for geothermal energy, of course, it is not 14 areas of green growth strategy. However, we are aiming at the maximum introduction of renewables. Of course, geothermal is very important and one of the key energy sources of the renewables. So we will promote geothermal energy, but at this moment, I cannot say the specific measures on geothermal promotion at the time being. So please allow me to by saying that we have to introduce maximum capacity of the renewables, including
Thank you, Mr. Matsuda. It's time, so we are moving on to the next presentation. Mr. Ross Matskin-Bridger, Energy Attaché and DOE Director, U.S. Embassy, Tokyo, will give a lecture titled U.S. Energy Policy in 2021 and Beyond. Mr. Matskin-Bridger, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Takahashi. I think you can all hear me now and hopefully see my presentation. Wave if you can't, but I think you can. Good morning to my friends and colleagues here in Japan. Good evening to those of you joining from the United States. It is a great honor to be here once again at the I²CNER Annual Symposium. I would like to first thank President Ishibashi and Director Sophronis for inviting me. I would also like to congratulate I²CNER on its acceptance into the WPI Academy under the leadership of Dr. Kuroki. I²CNER has played a vital role in US-Japan clean energy collaboration over the past decade plus, and I expect its importance to only grow in the coming months and years. Last year, I gave a presentation at this symposium on US energy policy under the Trump administration. And today I would like to give a similar presentation, but updated for what we might expect under the new Biden administration. My plan is to speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll be happy to take any questions that there may be from the field. Okay, so I'd like to start by highlighting what I see as the three main pillars of US energy policy. And if you joined the symposium last year, you may recognize that these pillars have not changed. And in fact, these are the key drivers that really have stayed constant for decades now over multiple administration changes, no matter what the political party is that's in power. While different administrations certainly may put a particular focus on one pillar or the other, the fundamentals of these priorities for US energy policy remain solid over time. The first pillar is the economy pillar, and this is about job creation and growth in the energy sector. It's about ensuring that we have energy that's affordable and easily accessible for all of our citizens. The second pillar we have is security, and this is really talking about security on several different fronts. Energy security, making sure that we have enough energy that's abundant and accessible for us as well as our allies like Japan. It's cybersecurity, making sure that our critical infrastructure, our electricity grid is protected against potential malicious actors. And then for a country like the United States, and Japan certainly would fall into this category as well, we have nuclear energy as an important part of our energy mix. And so nuclear security and non-proliferation values are something that's very important to us in the United States as well. And then our third pillar, of course, is the environment. And this is where we're focused on keeping our air and water clean. It's, utilizing as many of those clean energy resources as we can, while at the same time making fossil energy less dirty. And then, of course, minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. So with these as our kind of fundamental, relatively unchanging pillars, I'd like to move on to what the Biden administration's approach is to these pillars of US energy policy. After President Biden won the presidential election in November, he announced 4 top priorities for his incoming administration. Half of these priorities, one being climate change and the other being economic recovery, are directly related to energy policy. This gives a clear indication that energy will in fact play a central role in the Biden administration's governing approach. thinking back to the three pillars on my previous slide, traditionally, we have often thought of the economy and the environment pillars as trade-offs, that perhaps focusing on one detracts from the other. Some argue, for example, that the Trump administration put a heavy emphasis on the economy, cutting regulations and prioritizing private sector energy growth, but that this came at the detriment of the environment. Some people then have a natural concern that under President Biden, the US may shift the other way, putting an emphasis on the environment to the detriment of the economy. However, one of the biggest pushes that we have seen so far from the Biden administration is to make the case that we don't have to choose between the economy and the environment, that focusing on one need not detract from the other. President Biden argues that economic interests and environmental interests can be complementary, and if we approach this the right way, then saving our environment will also go a long way towards bolstering our economy. So, what kinds of policies will the Biden administration focus on? I'd like to do my best to answer that as I go through my presentation. But one of the early goals the administration has laid out is to achieve a power sector free of CO2 emissions by 2035. This is an extremely ambitious but achievable goal. So zeroing in then on the power sector in the United States, let's take a look at where things stand today so we understand what the challenges will be for achieving our 2035 goal. You can see on this slide that I have our latest official figures from the Department of Energy, which show total generation as of the end of 2019. But today I can kind of unofficially share what I think the updated figures will be as of today. So you can see that as of the end of 2019, natural gas made up 38% of our electricity mix in the United States. I think what we're going to see for the latest figures is that that number is up a little bit to perhaps closer to 40%. Coal was 24% a year ago, but today I think we're going to see that it's actually closer to 20%. Having lost a fairly significant share over the last 12 months, continuing a trend that we've seen from coal really over the last couple decades. Nuclear has remained steady at 20% and today is also 20%. And then renewables here at the end of 2019, I think we saw it around 17%, but today that is probably bumped up to closer to 20%. And the trends that you've seen between just last year and this year are really the trends that we've seen for quite some time now. You can see the capacity additions that we had for 2019 came largely from natural gas, wind, and solar, and this has really been the case for many years now. For many years, the United States has been retiring older, dirtier fossil fuel plants, particularly coal plants, as well as some older natural gas plants. And we've been adding a lot of new capacity, or I should say almost all of the new capacity that we've added has come from natural gas, wind, and solar. You can see here now what our official forecast is for 2021. And you can see that it's shifting even more heavily towards renewables. We're looking at the lion's share of our additional capacity in 2021 coming from solar and wind. Still a healthy 16% of additional capacity from natural gas. And then I think very significantly, we're predicting that 11% of our new capacity on the grid in 2021 will come from batteries. And I think that this is has the potential over time to really become a game changer, because if we can bring a lot of utility scale batteries to the grid, this has the potential to for us to be able to combine battery storage with intermittent renewable sources like solar and wind to create something of a base load clean energy source by combining batteries with renewables. So I think that that'll be something to keep an eye on. So I think my takeaway from this is that in the United States, we're headed in the right direction towards our ambitious 2035 goal. However, we still have a long way to go, and there's a lot we're going to need to do in order to reach a carbon neutral power sector within the next 14 years. So how do we decarbonize? I think the basic formula is pretty simple. We have to maximize clean energy generation from sources such as wind, solar, and nuclear. We have to maximize energy efficiency, and we have to eliminate or offset emissions from baseload fossil sources such as natural gas and coal. So how do we go about doing that as the federal government? Well, it is certainly going to be a monumental challenge, but I think we're up to the task. There's several different roles that the US federal government can play to help make some of the Biden administration's goals a reality. None of this will be easy, and I do not want to give the impression that we will definitely be pursuing every single item on this list, but I do want to give you an idea of what instruments we have at our disposal to tackle this monumental challenge of reducing and eliminating our emissions in the power sector. And so the first tool we have is the potential for federal laws or regulations governing emissions. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on my next slide. This is a powerful tool, but one that is also very challenging to implement politically. Second tool that we have is federal incentives for clean power. So these are things like giving tax breaks for utilities that bring certain amounts of renewables onto the grid. And we've had a lot of success actually with these kinds of incentives over the years, over multiple administrations. We have implemented federal incentives for renewables. We've also implemented federal incentives for carbon capture technologies. And we've had a lot of success in using incentives to bring technologies into reality. And then kind of the bread and butter of what the US Department of Energy does, and what I think can play a very important role for achieving the Biden administration's goals moving forward, is accelerating our efforts to develop and deploy technologies required to really substantially reduce emissions in the power sector. And so there's many areas where we can be looking at here, but some of these, I think, are areas where we're going to want to put significant budgets towards programs where we can perfect these technologies and actually bring them to commercialization. Of course, solar, wind deployment, I would include other renewables in this as well. Really understanding how we can maximize the deployment of renewables onto the grid. Then modernizing the grid that we have, whether that be through things like smart grids or just having a better interconnected and interdependent grid. There's a lot that I think we can be doing with batteries and hydrogen. Batteries, I've already mentioned, we are starting to bring them onto the grid at utility scale, and this can be a real game changer if we're able to pair these with renewables. Hydrogen, of course, has been such a focus of I²CNER and other research institutes, and it's something that we take quite seriously at the Department of Energy as well. And I think that there's lots of room for hydrogen to play an important role in our clean energy future. Nuclear, I think, will play a very important role. It has maintained a steady 20% share of the US electricity mix for years now, and it is still our single largest source of non-carbon emitting electricity. It is also a baseload source of electricity, so very important for the United States, but it does face challenges and we'll have to make some improvements if we're going to keep nuclear as an important part of our mix. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, I think is going to be really vitally important for us moving forward, because if we have this goal of a power sector free of carbon emissions by 2035, I think when we look at our electricity mix today, 40% coming from natural gas, it's probably going to be a tall order to eliminate all of that by 2035. So what we have to focus on is how do we make natural gas cleaner? And I think to date, a lot of our CCUS efforts have focused on coal, but I do think that moving forward, we're going to see a lot of efforts for how we might be able to implement CCUS, not just with coal, but with natural gas as well. And then efficiency for buildings. Of course, if we can reduce the amount of electricity we use, we can reduce our carbon emissions as well. And then finally, game-changing technologies. And it's really hard to predict what the next game changer will be, but this is just such a vital role for the government to play, I believe, in investing in high-risk, high-reward type research, because we know over time, as we've done this, when we do make those investments, yes, there are a lot of projects that fail, but that's part of the process. And and every so often we hit one of those home runs where we find a game-changing technology that actually can be implemented economically and at scale in ways that just transform what we think about energy. And over the years, we've seen that with various technologies. And while it's very hard to predict what that next game changer might be, I do predict that there will be one that we'll see in the not too distant future. And so I want to go back and talk a little bit about the tool that I mentioned that the US government has for either passing new laws or regulations to mandate CO2 emission reductions. And in the United States, these types of mandates have largely come from individual states rather than the federal government. And you can see here that we have these kinds of mandates across different states. California, for example, has a very ambitious one of 60% of electricity has to be generated from clean energy sources by 2030 and 100% by 2045. You can see from this graphic here that each state kind of has their own individualized goal. But the federal government, the United States as a whole, the US government certainly has the power to regulate or pass laws to regulate CO2 emissions if it wished to do so. However, it can be very difficult to reach agreement when the states have these widely varying ideas of how to best manage the problem. In 2015, the Obama administration announced its Clean Power Plan, a set of policies that would give the Environmental Protection Agency the ability to enforce federal standards for CO2 emissions. However, this plan was not a law passed by Congress, but rather an executive order that was implemented by the president. And because of that, this rule was immediately challenged in the courts. And before the courts had a chance to rule on this Clean Power Plan, the Trump administration came to power and rescinded the plan. So the Biden administration essentially has three options on how they may want to tackle this issue of legally enforceable CO2 emission mandates. There could be an effort to revive something like the Clean Power Plan through an executive order, but I think we've seen that that would be met with certain legal challenges from those who are opposed. We could work, or the administration could work with Congress to pass legislation mandating CO2 cuts, although, as I mentioned, it can sometimes be difficult to get a political consensus when different states have very different ideas on how to tackle this problem. Or the Biden administration could decide that we're happy with the legal mandates that exist in the states, and instead the federal government should focus on other means of encouraging emission reductions. So I'd like to then take a look at where we stand in terms of CO2 emissions in the United States. And what you can see here is that our emissions really increased quite a bit from 1985 up to the mid-2000s. But since 2005, we've done a pretty good job of reducing. In fact, we've reduced emissions 13% from 2005 levels, which I think is it's a very positive direction that we've moved in. That said, you can see that over the past several years, we've stagnated a little bit. And I'd like to explain a little bit about what's going on. So if we break down our CO2 emissions by source, what we can see is really in the power sector, we've been on a pretty positive trend. We've reduced emissions from coal by quite a bit. Now that has kind of come at the same time that natural gas emissions have gone up, but you can make the argument that this is a fair trade-off in that natural gas is, of course, much less carbon intensive than coal. So as we've reduced our reliance on coal and brought more natural gas electricity production online, that has on net helped us reduce our CO2 emissions in the power sector. So I think the message here is we made a lot of good progress, but again, if we're going to be aiming for zero power sector emissions by 2035, we have a lot of work ahead of us as well. But you see here, okay, so in the power sector, we've been going down, but then why are total emissions in the United States, why have they been stagnant over the last few years and not going down? And the answer there is really what you see here with petroleum. And so our emissions from petroleum really did go down from the mid-2000s, maybe up until about 2011 or 12. But since that time, our petroleum emissions have been creeping up again. And this is largely from the transportation sector. So I think another important message here is that we have some really ambitious goals in the power sector, and we're making good progress on those. But looking at the whole picture of CO2 emissions, we also will need to take a very close look at what's going on in the transportation sector. Okay, I'd like to switch gears just a little bit now and talk about a few of the individual energy sources that we have that are very important for the United States. And I'd like to start with natural gas. As you've heard from this presentation so far, natural gas makes up about 40% of the US electricity mix. It's also an important strategic resource for us for our energy security, as well as exporting natural gas to ensure the energy security of our friends and allies like Japan. At the same time, we have this ambitious goal of a power sector free of CO2 emissions by 2035. And so some might think, well, these two things seem contradictory. But what I would say is that natural gas is going to continue to be an important part of the US electricity mix. Natural gas production will continue to exceed consumption in the United States. We will continue to be a robust exporter of natural gas, but we are going to, I believe, put a a stronger focus on making natural gas cleaner. So as I mentioned, next slide here, as I already mentioned, I think we're going to be looking a lot closer at natural gas carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology for natural gas. I think we're also going to be taking a look at a couple issues we've seen with natural gas production, methane leaks and flaring that will be under some greater scrutiny. I won't go into too much detail on this. I'm conscious of time here, but these are some practices that I think with some new technology we have to detect methane leaks in particular, we'll get a better handle of what the scope of the problem is and how we can fix it as quickly as possible. I also want to, of course, mention hydrogen. I know that this is such an integral part of what I²CNER does and is also important for what we're doing at the U.S. Department of Energy. Our H2 at Scale program is continuing, and this is our program that explores the potential for wide-scale hydrogen production and utilization, really in the power generation as well as the transportation sectors. And I'm really excited for what we might be able to do with hydrogen moving forward. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what kind of priority the Biden administration puts on hydrogen. I won't say too much more about nuclear, but just want to emphasize that nuclear continues to be an important part of the electricity mix in the United States. It's important for our clean energy goals and remains the largest single source of non-CO2 emitting electricity that we have in the United States. And finally, I just want to say a few words about the importance of the US-Japan energy relationship, which of course I²CNER plays an important role in. Both the United States and Japan now have very ambitious and forward-leaning goals for reducing carbon emissions. Achieving these goals will take monumental efforts and significant funding. Now, we could decide to approach these challenges as individual nations, with the United States doing its own thing here and Japan doing its own thing there. But I suggest that we may in fact discover that we can reach our goals with more efficiency and less cost if we combine our expertise and engage in joint collaboration. I believe that there are large-scale, concrete projects that we can be working on together that will help us reach those ambitious goals that our respective administrations have set out. I look forward to deepening our bilateral energy partnership in concrete, tangible ways over the coming months. And with that, I will end my presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions there may be.
Thank you, Mr. Matskin-Bridger. If you have any questions or comments, please type in the Q&A box. From Dr. Takao Tomizutani, European countries will shut down coal plants by 2030 to 2040. Any plan to shut down all coal plants in US?
Great, thank you very much for that question. So I would say that we're still in the very early days of the Biden administration right now. It's hard to say exactly what policies the new administration will come out with. So I don't want to try and make too many predictions right now on the specifics. That said, I will say that there has been a trend for many years now that coal is becoming a smaller and smaller part of our energy mix. And that has largely been occurring not because of any kind of federal mandate to end coal power, but just by market forces as well as from different rules and regulations that we see at the individual state levels. So already I think we're definitely trending in that direction of less and less coal, and I expect that that trend will continue in the coming years as well.
Also from Dr. Mizutani, Al Gore said in his book, if peaking generation by oil could be converted to battery, major CO2 output could be remarkably reduced. Any plan to reduce such peaking power plants?
Thank you for that. If I understand the question correctly, I think you're talking about kind of fossil fuels on the grid and replacing them with batteries to be combined with intermittent renewable sources like wind and solar. I would say that, yes, we are already starting to see some of this. We know, of course, that intermittent power from sources like wind and solar are a vitally important part of our electricity mix in the United States, but we also know that those sources by themselves don't provide the 24/7 electricity that we need. So they need to be backed up by something. And yes, traditionally that has been the role of baseload fossil plants, and particularly natural gas plants that kind of fill that peak need in the United States. As I pointed out, in 2021, we're actually expecting 11% of new capacity in the U.S. electricity, in the U.S. grid to be coming from batteries. And, the more batteries that we're able to bring on the grid, the more we can kind of make that battery renewable combination that would allow us to have kind of a base, kind of like a base load clean energy source by combining the intermittent renewables with the batteries.
Thank you, Mr. Matskin-Bridger. It's time, so we are moving on to the next presentation.
Okay, we are starting Invited Lecture C now. I am Dino Klotz from I²CNER. I will be the MC from here, and Dr. Jill Engel-Cox, Director, Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, will give a presentation titled Scenarios of a Sustainable Energy Transition, Perspectives from the US. Dr. Engel-Cox, please start your presentation.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to see people's faces, and I'm very delighted to have been asked to speak at this event. Thank you, Petros and Andrew, for your invitation, and to all of you there. I do, of course, wish I was there in person. It would be much more delightful to be standing there and being in Japan right now. But here we are. Many opportunities here, though, to learn how to do these types of engagement remotely. And I think we've learned a tremendous amount over the past 10 months. So I will go ahead and share my screen. I want to thank also the previous speaker, Ross, has done a wonderful job setting up for my talk. In fact, I actually hid a few slides that he has covered for me, which hopefully will enable us some time for questions at the end. So I'm going to talk a little bit about scenarios for a sustainable energy transition, particularly focusing on what we have learned during this very unique year in 2020 with the COVID events and how dramatic that affected our energy systems and what that might mean going forward. And I will talk a little bit also about the new plans coming with our new administration. So I'll start with a little bit of overview about NREL very briefly in the institute I'm in, a little bit on energy and the impact of COVID, looking at future scenarios and where we're thinking things might go, but of course we don't know, and then close with a perspective on a post-COVID future and what we have learned from this unique year. So just very briefly, I am at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It is one of 17 US Department of Energy national laboratories. And the little circle there is where I'm sitting right now. Colorado is where we are located. And this is a view of our laboratory. We're in the mountains just west of Denver. And NREL is focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that is our primary focus. Almost 3,000 employees on this campus, including the image on the right is our wind test site very close by. And you can see that we cover all of the renewable energy technologies. And the institute that I work with is a collaboration between NREL and multiple universities. We pride ourselves with collaborating with universities, which is why I so enjoy attending and participating in this event, the collaboration between different countries and universities, looking at energy, economics, and resilience. Resilience being such an important word now as we consider what's happened over the past year. So moving on to energy and COVID particularly. So as Ross presented before, we have been undergoing a transition in electric power generation in the US over this time. And you can see, as was mentioned before, the transition from coal to natural gas, and then also the rise in renewables. We have about 11% of our US electricity is from wind and solar and biomass. And if you include hydropower, getting close to 18%, natural gas, 38%. But what we discovered when we had the shutdown from COVID in the first half of 2020, which is also a time when you have significant renewables because it's windy, and wind being a very large part of our renewable portfolio. The first 6 months of 2020, we had 22% of our power generation was from renewables, and coal declined to 17%. And this continued through the year, a little bit less on the renewable side as the year continued, but a pretty dramatic shift in a very, very short amount of time. Just a brief side note, I will be talking about numbers that are for the entire United States, but the US being a large country that was very diverse in its resources, including its energy resources, individual states have pretty significantly different numbers from the national numbers. So while solar is about getting close to 3% in the US broadly, in California, solar photovoltaics are 20% of its energy generation. So a significantly higher amount. And then if you look at wind on the right-hand side, you've got the states that are in the middle part of the US, several of them over 40% wind power, and many states over 20% wind power. So pretty significant difference state by state. So that's just an important item to note, is that these numbers can vary pretty significantly by regions. And I'm sure that will be, that is definitely true in Japan as well, I'm sure. So if you look at what happened in our consumption due to COVID, the US consumption of electricity has been pretty flat over the past couple decades. But in 2020, electricity demand declined almost 4% in a single year compared to 2019. In April, so that was the date when it was most locked down, electricity demand was down 13% compared to previous Aprils. This decline was in the commercial and industrial sector was down between 6 and 8%, and with a small increase in residential because many of us were working from home and a lot of commercial sector and industrial sectors was shut down. This is expected to recover partly by 2022. It's expected to recover in 2021, partly, and then on into 2022. But I think there is still a real question about what sectors will recover fully and what sectors will remain at a different level compared to history. With our natural gas consumption similar, our natural gas consumption in 2020 was down 2.5%, largely from residential and commercial demand. Power production actually converted a little bit more to natural gas as coal declined pretty dramatically in 2020, and that decline is expected to continue. And our liquids and fuels production, which is a substitute for consumption, was down 12% in 2020. This is largely due to a decline in transportation and industrial demand, although this is expected to decline, to rebound by 2022. So pretty significant change. I think if you had asked anyone in 2019 if the US could experience a 12% decline in oil and gas, in oil and liquid fuels in a single year, I don't think anybody would have predicted that that would have been possible. Liquefied natural gas exports have been growing ever since they really became starting in 2016. But I'll point out a pretty dramatic shift here that happened in the middle of 2020. So we've been growing our export capacity over time, but due to the shutdown, due to COVID, we had significantly more export capacity than was actually being exported, declined 50% during the summer of 2020 due to decreased demand. Again, expected to rebound by 2021, but a very dramatic impact on the natural gas industry, which has been growing significantly in the country, and a pretty significant effect. Coal consumption also down in April 2020, it was down 27% from April 2019. Some predict a partial recovery in 2021. Some are predicting a continuous decline in coal consumption as it has been declining for over a decade. And then final slide on impact, I believe. If you look at US employment, obviously many jobs were lost in many sectors, but there was a pretty significant loss of jobs in clean energy employment, including energy efficiency, fuels, transmission, vehicles, and power generation. And there has only been a partial recovery from a 600,000 job lost in the spring of 2020. So my main point on these slides is, and this is getting into a greenhouse gas emissions reduction, is that we can predict change, but we cannot predict major disruption. So in 2020, the US greenhouse gas emissions declined 9% in 1 year. Which is a staggering decline in a single year, given that while they had been in decline over the previous couple decades, a single year decline in this range was unprecedented. And the slide, the image here at the bottom is an attempt to predict how greenhouse gas emissions might go in the future in the US, depending on the different types of economic recoveries. A V-shaped recovery, it was predicted that the economy would decline, there would be job losses, and then it would recover relatively rapidly. An L-shaped recovery is that it would decline and the economy would not recover. And so you can see the varying predictions, potential policy predictions of where the greenhouse gas emissions recovery may or may not happen in the US based on this very dramatic year. So when I shift to future scenarios of US energy use, my key point from looking at a year in COVID activities is that we really cannot predict the future. We can, and really the solution to the inability to predict where things might be going is to look at different scenarios. So when at NREL, we run an annual standard scenarios report, and these scenarios are used then for our modeling going forward. And you can see in this, for the 2020 report, we did 45 different scenarios, looking at everything from high renewables prices to low natural gas prices, to low renewable prices to high natural gas. And this chart is showing the level of penetration of renewables by 2050, which goes as high as over 80% to as low as about 30%. And so by running these different scenarios, we can make decisions on where we want to invest in research, where we want to change policies, where we want to consider different approaches to driving towards particular goals. And so this has been, so you can go actually to this website and there's a viewer where you can actually look at all the different scenarios. This is what's considered the mid-case scenario. So it's the middle option. And in it, you can see a pretty dramatic increase in solar, which is the yellow, offshore wind, or different onshore and offshore wind in blue, and then natural gas still playing a fairly large role in the mid-case scenario, coal and nuclear both declining. There are different scenarios that have different levels of predictions going forward. And so it's really, again, it's important to think about these different scenarios when making decisions. I think the other thing to remember, though, is that we still could have a major disruption that would have a pretty dramatic impact on any particular year. So again, important to think about these scenarios for resilience. The right-hand chart shows the different options for different states, different parts of the country. And so you can see the Western states have a significantly large amount of solar and renewables, while some parts of the middle states still have some dependence, potentially some dependence on coal, and then very large wind in the middle part of the country. So the other thing that we're looking for, so that was really an emphasis on power, but there's a number of different energy demands that we need to be thinking about, and how we actually combine these, and then thinking about what role hydrogen has in energy storage. So really what's going to be important going forward is these hybrid energy solutions. So thinking about how when you have a large amount of renewables on the grid, how they can those excess electrons can be converted into things like hydrogen for storage or for other industrial uses. It's also important to think about thermal storage and how that can be used for industrial processes. So we're really beginning to think about solutions not as single technologies, but how they integrate into a system. And this includes also includes carbon capture and how carbon capture can be incorporated, as well as wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, captured carbon, converting to things like syngas and natural gas storage. There's a tremendous interest in green natural gas and how it can integrate into an existing natural gas pipeline system, as well as in other types of energy systems. So the key point of this is that we need to be thinking about our energy system as a whole and not just as electricity. Similarly, we are also starting to think about systems from an agricultural perspective and industrial perspective. So if we get very large amounts of renewables, it's going to take a lot of space. So the image on the right is some work that is being done to consider how renewables can better integrate with land use in terms of growing crops, working with animals, as well as, and this can be for both solar and wind. We're also looking at scaling up. So looking at extremely large, potentially extremely long offshore wind turbines. Offshore wind is going to become a significant part of, or increased part of renewables in the United States. And so we're looking at the potential for advanced wind turbines that are not only very large, but can also accommodate high winds and very dramatic storm systems that may be necessary in some of our locations in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's going to be a lot of necessary for new technologies being developed. Also important is considering the supply chain. All of these renewables are going to take a tremendous amount of raw materials. And so thinking about that supply chain and how those can be sustainably developed. We have a program that's looking at mining and processing of raw materials and how those can be done in a way that has a limited or reduced environmental impact. And so thinking about that supply chain and keeping that system in mind as we're developing these going forward will also be important. And then also making those industries more resilient to these big disruptions, such as we saw with COVID in the last year. And then also it's very important to think about the recycling and recovery of these materials at the end of life, and then reinserting them back into the material supply chain. So I want to close a little bit with some thoughts on where we're going in the future. And this is going to include some additional information on the new administration from the US, as well as some closing thoughts on disruption and resilience. So Ross presented on some of the elements of the new Biden administration, including carbon-free power by 2035 and net economy-wide net zero emissions by 2050, both very aggressive goals, but doable, at least especially the carbon-free power sector by 2035, but will require new technologies. Other elements, rejoining the Paris Accord, this has already been announced. Other elements, reducing building carbon footprints by 50%. There's also a very strong focus on environmental justice or environmental equity. There is going to be an emphasis on rural communities as well as disadvantaged communities. So if you think about where renewables, as well as oil and gas and the mining for materials comes from, those largely come from rural locations, then with the energy shipped to urban areas. So there is an emphasis we predict on how these rural areas can also benefit from a clean transition to a clean energy economy. There's going to be an emphasis potentially on climate smart agriculture. So what is the role that bio-based crops and food crops can have, and the land use for agriculture can be used to sequester emissions. There's going to be potentially a lot of infrastructure investments, rail, public transit, building upgrades, water systems, green space, and an expansion of communications also in these rural and disadvantaged communities. One of the things that was learned during this COVID time, when you had people having to work from home and children going to school from home, is that many people do not have access to good internet and to good broadband communications. And this is going to be an emphasis as well. And then there'll be reversing some of the environmental deregulations that Ross also talked about. But what does this mean from a research perspective, from a scientific perspective? What are the areas that we are going to have to focus on in order to reach these goals? Grid scale storage was already mentioned. So that will be batteries, but also the seasonal and storage that would go over from a season, from a monthly basis. So this will include hydrogen, pumped hydropower, and other types of longer scale storage. So storage at different scales and timeframes. There's also research going on advanced small modular reactors, That was mentioned also, I noticed, as part of the Japan plan potentially. Refrigeration and air conditioning, which could be growing in pretty significantly in the US, but also in many emerging economies. But we want that refrigeration and air conditioning to not have global warming potential refrigerants. Zero net energy buildings at zero net cost. So how do we get buildings that have all these advanced functions, but be not any extra cost? Renewably generated hydrogen, key with that will be to get the cost down on that to be cost effective compared to hydrogen, the current way we generate hydrogen from natural gas. There's going to be a very big challenge to decarbonize industrial heat for industrial processes, especially around steel, concrete, and the production of chemicals. This will not be done by solar PV. It's going to need new technologies to be able to get us there. Potentially hydrogen, but there may be other technologies that we will need to develop to do that. Decarbonizing our food supply and agriculture. Food and agriculture, growing food, as well as food processing and then transporting it, is a very large amount of our greenhouse gas emissions. I've seen estimates anywhere from 15% to 25%. Depending how you count. So decarbonizing that, and that's kind of a funny word to say decarbonizing food, but basically reducing the energy demand from food production, processing, and transport. Direct carbon CO2 capture from industry and direct air capture could be potentially important. I will say that a key element of that will be the utilization of that captured carbon into productive materials and processes. And then supply chain resilience. If we've seen anything with COVID, that supply chain resilience becomes even more important, and the ability for it to be flexible, to be able to adapt from providing supplies to restaurants and large commercial structures to residences and vice versa. We saw a tremendous disruption in our supply chain of our food here in the US as COVID affected large industrial processes and other areas. So supply chain resilience and flexibility and potentially decentralization of some of that, I think, will be something that it needs to be developed and explored from a research perspective. So I'd like to close with just a few perspectives from this special year in the past year, and then hopefully that will give us about 10 minutes for questions. First is that it's hard to predict the future. In fact, you could argue that we can never predict the future, particularly because we'll have major disruptions and changes. So scenarios can help us plan approaches and investments to maximize what our desired effects will be. The long-term trend towards cleaner energy continues, and that will continue even with this potential disruptions, potential change, potential that may happen over time. So the key is to focus on the fundamental drivers of positive change. That includes research into new technologies. It includes economics in terms of developing technologies that are not only cleaner, but that are lower cost so that they become the first choice in the marketplace. It involves having policy changes that incentivize industry and individuals making the right decisions. And it involves listening to our social values, selecting technologies that align well with our social values for the parts of the country and parts of the world that are implementing these technologies. You can have the most wonderful technology, but if it goes against social norms or disadvantages some parts of the community in a highly negative way more than others, then you won't be able to, that trend becomes much harder to maintain. Disruption can take 10 years, which is what we've seen in this decadal change with clean energy, or it can take 10 months. You can have a very rapid change due to a disruption such as COVID happen. And so the key is that resilience and flexibility and diversity of energy but also of many things in our life are just as important as cost and quality. So those are going to be really important to be considering and when technology solutions are explored. And finally, our lives were really radically changed this year. I'm here making this presentation in the US in my home when I could have been in Japan seeing all of you if we could have been flying around the country. So we've all learned a lot this year. We have learned how to do workshops and events remotely, and we've actually accomplished more than I think we ever imagined. And I think we can continue to do that as we learn to work together. And whether that's remote, whether that's all physically in the same room, or whether it's all together in cyberspace, the key is working together as countries and as individuals. We can do more than we ever really imagined that we ever did. Don't think again at the beginning of 2020, we would have imagined all we would have accomplished and how we could have all worked together in such unique ways that were beyond imagination at the beginning of the year. And I think that should inspire us to be thinking about that we can make radical change in the way we use energy and the way we create energy much faster than we ever could have imagined before we had to face these disruptions going forward. So hopefully that's an inspiring note. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. And I believe we still have some time for questions. So I'm looking forward to those.
Thank you very much, Dr. Engel-Cox. And as she said, if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the Q&A box. There is one question from Dr. Takao Mitsutani. Battery of electronic vehicles could be grid scale storage in the near future. Any forecast number on such battery for electronic vehicles?
Yes, so some people are looking at repurposing batteries from electric vehicles for grid storage. Basically, at the end of life in a vehicle, they have to obviously be very highly efficient and really high capacity. So there has been some discussion of repurposing those batteries as large-scale storage. I think that does have a potential. We need to develop the systems to collect those batteries after life and be able to connect them to each other. So one of the challenges is that electric vehicles many of them use different types of batteries. It's not the same battery cell in every vehicle. And also they're assembled into packs that are different configurations. So whether you've got a Tesla or a Toyota, there's different types of battery chemistries and different sizes. So the big challenge on putting those together will be, how do you either use the same batteries from the same vehicle, but also change over the life of so a Tesla from 2015 isn't necessarily the same battery composition as the Tesla from 2020. So that's going to be the biggest challenge of sort of recombining and reconfiguring. Many people now are putting together, so right now I think the emphasis is probably more on new batteries and new battery systems put in the grid, but for grid scale storage, but I think there's a potential for it, and I think people are exploring it, but it may be more on a company by company level.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Maybe from the speakers, they can ask the questions directly, because all the other participants are muted. So I encourage again to type in questions. If not, I have a quick question. I saw the numbers you said in the job losses in the energy sector. There were huge numbers. I didn't see the percentages of those jobs.
Yeah, I don't have an exact percentage. In terms of percentage of those working in that space, I don't have the exact percentages. I'd have to pull those. It was pretty significant though. And it was interesting because a lot of them were on the efficiency side. So a lot of our clean energy jobs are efficiency jobs, which require people to go to buildings, do efficiency inspections, install new windows, new high efficiency air conditioning systems, these types of things. So that sector was pretty heavily impacted. Some of the manufacturing was impacted early on. Interestingly enough, there was still a strong installation of renewables. I didn't show all of those numbers, but in terms of new solar, new wind, those installations, they had a dip in the beginning, but those did continue pretty significantly, especially because some of the policy incentives originally were going to run out at the end of 2020, but some of those were actually extended. So some of that, those types of jobs did continue, but there was pretty significant loss in sort of some of those job sectors for that area. Yeah. So we're still hoping that some of those will recover. I'm looking at the slide again, and actually it was the percentage was 13% of clean energy employment was lost at the bottom. So yeah. Any other questions? Oh, I think Petros is trying to ask. There we go.
Yeah, you see, since I'm a member of the panel here, I cannot ask questions, but since I can step forward and ask you a question regarding storage, Jill. Ross told us about batteries, that they are going almost to take up about 10% of the ball game in the next year. What about hydrogen? Is there a better storage, device, means than hydrogen?
Yeah.
Or for instance, for power scale storage.
Mm-hmm. So I believe that battery number is the new capacity added. So it won't be 10% of the existing storage. It'll be 10% of new capacity. And that reflects the utilities recognizing that now that, as I showed on that one slide, some states have pretty high levels of renewables, 20 to 40%, that they do need that battery storage to compensate for often when you have solar going down and before wind comes up. And so a lot of the utilities are starting with the battery storage because they need that 4 to 6 hour compensation for the level of renewables. As renewables get even more, we are starting to do, some companies are doing research on hydrogen as a storage. Xcel Energy and NREL, as well as some other partners, is doing a pilot plant to do hydrogen production with excess electrons. So because that system has nuclear power on it as well, and they don't want to cycle the nuclear power plant up and down. And it's getting enough renewables that you have times when basically electricity goes to negative prices or zero price. So that's the time, rather than shut off something or curtail the renewables or the nuclear power plant in some way, that they're going to start generating hydrogen. So we are seeing a pilot project that's going to be coming online to be doing that, but it just isn't quite there yet in terms of the installation yet.
Okay, thank you.
And it's nice to see you, Petros.
Yes, by all means. It's been almost 2 years now, right? We missed the symposium this year in Fukuoka.
Yes.
Let's hope next year is going to be in Fukuoka.
I hope next year. I will be there.
Okay, I would say we're good in time. So thank you again for the discussion. And we're moving on to the next presentation. Professor Benjamin McLellan, Graduate School of Engineering of Energy Science, Kyoto University, and also a research fellow at Sustainable Minerals Institute, University of Queensland, will give a presentation titled Trade and Tribulations, the Reshaping of Australia's Energy Supply Sector During COVID-19. Professor McLellan, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dina. So first of all, happy Australia Day. Today is Australia's National Day. Well, for the First Nation people of Australia, it's not necessarily a happy day, but for those of European background, it's the day that we celebrate. Anyway, so I'm going to cover some of, I think some of what I'm going to cover will overlap a bit with the US, partly, I guess, because of the similarities, at least in terms of the some of the exporting priorities. But I'm going to cover effectively in three parts. The first part, I just want to remind everybody, or to maybe let you know for the first time about the general energy situation of Australia. The second component will be then looking at what some of the effects of the pandemic were, or of and during the pandemic, because not all of them will have been specifically due to the pandemic. And then at the end, to look at some of the sort of the way forward, or the way that this has changed, hopefully maybe look at some of the way that this has changed things. So I am, yes, Australian by background, and still have an affiliation with the University of Queensland, though I am predominantly based here in Japan. So I've basically the outline of some of the changes, or some of the aspects of the energy landscape that I really want to look at, highlighted on the left-hand side here. So domestically, there are a few issues. Of course, the pandemic has had some direct impacts on consumption. Some of the flow-on impacts of people not being able to work, particularly in some of the sectors which are important in Australia, such as tourism, has led to impacts on affordability. So people losing jobs and therefore not being able to afford energy. There have been some energy and mix effects, but I think many of these are broadly related to the decrease in demand. And of course, there are international impacts, which we want to look at. So some of these are about the direct impacts on trade and also travel, not being able to fly everywhere. Well, domestically as well as internationally has had some effect. But also there have been ongoing geopolitical disputes, which notably with China, which have been particularly exacerbated partly because of the Australian government's response to the COVID-19, or at least the origins of COVID-19, but also sort of a trend of alliances and trade, ongoing trade issues, and then a couple of future trends, which have been growing in an ongoing sense over the years, and probably have gained a little bit of a push because of the pandemic. So first of all, then, if just to highlight the overall energy mix of Australia. So this is our historical consumption on the left, in terms of their overall energy consumption by fuel type. You can see renewables taking up, a relatively small proportion, but slight, of course, growing over time. This is across all sectors, so not just electricity. But just like the US, as we saw in the previous presentation, you can see that many of the states vary quite significantly. And so we can see that there are some states which have, such as Tasmania, which have a very large amount of renewables in their energy supply mix, but there are others which are much more dominant in coal in particular. So coal and oil, well, fossil fuels in general, still making up the majority of the energy mix in Australia. And when we look at the consumption, just briefly, I think to highlight where that energy is all going, A lot of that is, of course, in transport. It's a big country with a relatively low population, relatively large population centers spread out across the country. So somewhat like the US, it has a dependence on personal vehicles a lot in terms of travel. There's a lot of distance between places. So transport, unsurprisingly, has quite a large component in the energy consumption. Electricity supply being, again, another consumer of that primary energy. But maybe notably, what may be slightly different from many other places is the mining sector has quite a significant role to play. So Australia is, whilst being a developed country, has quite a heavy reliance on primary production, notably of minerals, both metals and fuels. Now I'm going to be showing some figures about electricity consumption and the electricity market. Most of that is going to be focused on what is in this big oval, which is the national electricity market. So this is approximately 90% of Australia's electricity consumption is in that area. And it is also where most of the population is. So you can see sort of a similar thing on this first slide. I will have a little bit of state-by-state data. So just turning to the electricity fuel mix. So this is the latest data that we can get for Australia overall is basically for the last quarter of last year. So this is just to compare to show the September to December period. Again, overall on the left-hand side here, we can see the mix around about 52% black coal, about 17% brown coal. So again, a very large chunk of the electricity supplied by coal, and a somewhat larger or gradually increasing component coming from wind and solar. But of course, again, this is broken down differently by state. Here, the percentage next to the name of the state, or the abbreviation for the state, is the overall percentage of the total electricity produced and consumed. As we go, so again, towards the, another thing to note is that most of this electricity is not, well, these electricity figures are the generated figures that don't include domestic generation, which is at the demand side. So again, you can see a split differently by state. The two sort of slightly more northern states have a larger percentage of solar. Towards the south, there's a larger percentage of wind. And I've, for the sake of Andrew, Professor Chapman, I have here expanded so that you can actually see South Australia, where he is from. So South Australia notably actually has around about a percentage which is accounted for as coming from batteries. So a couple of years ago, they installed what was at least then one of the largest batteries in the world. And South Australia, as you can see here, has a very large percentage of its energy coming from wind. At times last year, I think they had more than 100% of energy generated in the state being from renewables in total. Again, Tasmania over here, tiny little island, but producing a lot of hydro and wind, and they're gradually getting more interconnected. There is an interconnection between Tasmania and the mainland, but it's getting more interconnected so that they can transfer some of that energy. Australia's again, it's a country, you know, it's been referred to as a lucky country. It has a lot in terms of energy. It's very fortunate. It has many resources of basically any form of energy, both fossil and renewable. You can see here, this is just to focus a little bit on the energy export situation. So Australia is a very significant energy exporter. It produces much more energy in the form of coal, natural gas, and a small proportion of oil, but basically a lot more coal and gas than it uses. And mostly, a lot of this is exported, as you can see. So in terms of what is exported, again, you can see that most of it is brown coal, and this will be both for metallurgical purposes as well as for thermal purposes. There is also a large percentage there of, well, we do export a lot of LNG and a small amount of oil and LPG. So again, you can see there that basically there's a very large percentage of the energy which is produced that is actually exported. Now, it is an energy producing country, but at the same time, it does have energy imports. And notably, like many countries across the world, it imports a lot of oil. And also, when we see this slide, what we can note is that not only is it importing oil or crude oil, but certainly in the last 20 years or so, there's been an increase in the amount of refined petroleum products that's been imported. So this is significant in that you can see sort of on the right-hand graph here, there's a bit of an indication of some of the shutdowns, basically, of different refineries, shutdowns or at least temporary closures in some cases. But that really coincides with the increase in the amount of oil imported, or the refined products being imported. So there's been so again, one of the concerns of resilience of supply chains has certainly been the fact that there's less and less domestic refining, and therefore less security of supply, even if we have the crude oil storage. So again, an increasing amount of both oil and oil products being imported. Now, that was basically the situation pre-COVID. There are a lot of trends, you know, one year changes things, but 1 year doesn't change, things still continue on. So in terms of Australia's COVID situation, I just wanted to highlight just broadly what happened in Australia. So again, we're quite isolated from the rest of the world. And so basically the national borders to Australia were closed in March. So there was a period where Australian citizens and residents were being brought back to Australia. But basically, national borders closed to a large extent. State borders have also been periodically closed. So this is one thing which, again, may have been slightly different to some other countries in that the states have all had quite a different approach. And so within the country, we had state borders being closed to reduce transmission among states, particularly from the southern states of New South Wales and Victoria, where most of the cases happen. So New South Wales, where we have Sydney, and Victoria, which whose capital is Melbourne. So those states have had the largest number of cases, and they've also probably had the largest, well, the largest impacts. The shutdowns, which were, well, there were gradual phased in shutdowns or reductions in restrictions in gatherings, restrictions in what type of businesses could open. I would say, not having been in Australia at the time, but from what I've seen, while the shutdowns have been fairly strict, not to the extreme extent of things which you've seen in the United Kingdom or in many parts of Europe. This is just to extend that timeline. So that timeline only goes, this is from a report from the Grattan Institute in Australia, but that only went through to May. When we see the way that cases have happened, what we'll see is that in the Southern Hemisphere winter, we had quite a significant surge again in cases. At the moment, things have more or less opened up. So there are sort of suburb by suburb closures of in response to clusters, but basically things have opened up. Now it's in the Southern Hemisphere summer, so things are not, maybe people are not gathering as closely, etc. Again, there have been, so once we had the first closures in around March, of course it was hoped at the time that there would be, that the impacts, well, that the closures would be short, that somehow that it would be a relatively mild pandemic and a mild impact, but many people who worked in, again, as I mentioned, in fields like tourism and education, and also in the service sector, particularly in entertainment and things like that, many jobs were lost, and so affordability of energy has been one of the things which has been focused on. So people losing their jobs and then not being able to afford energy anymore has been quite significant. In terms of the economy overall, this is from a Queensland budget document. You can see here the comparison of the just over towards the end, the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019-2020, there was a significant decline in GDP, more so in Queensland perhaps than in the overall of Australia. Part of that because, again, of the reliance on tourism. So many of the sort of the famous tourist spots in Australia are in the northern states. And there's an expected sort of ongoing impact this year, which with these sort of very optimistic situation or expectation of recovery and rapid recovery in the next year. Now, I'm coming more to energy at the moment in the next few slides. I just wanted to note that, again, some of the effects that we've seen in Australia, or I would say actually many of them, are not just because of the pandemic, but have had underlying or preceding trends. So, for example, again, Australia is very dependent on commodity exports. And LNG prices or natural gas prices in general have basically been in decline for at least over most of the period of 2019. This flowed on through into 2020. And so, that's sort of an exacerbating factor, but not something which was caused by the pandemic itself. some of this has led to price reduction, which has been useful for consumers, but because again, there has been a bit of a decline in the overall consumption, that's maybe not flowed through as much. This is comparison between the third quarter of 2019 to the third quarter of 2020. So what we've seen is an overall reduction in electricity generation. It's broken down here by the type of or by the fuel type. We've seen an increase in renewables relative to 2019, which is basically because of an increase in infrastructure. In terms of the major fuels of black coal and gas, we've seen a decline, and that is interesting. That despite the fact that we've had despite the fact that they are lower in price, that we've had a reduction in generation. And overall 2% decline in electricity generation in that comparative quarter. Moreover, when we look at this on the basis of weekday, well, this is a comparison of weekday electricity demand. This is back in the period from April to May 2019 compared to the same period in 2020. What we see is that residential demand load has increased, and this is sort of corresponding with the period of lockdown where a lot of people were home. We had an increase in residential load, but at the same time, a decrease in commercial load. So in terms of the overall in terms of the overall load, you can see that certain periods of the day, basically through the typical working hours, we've had a decline in typical power generation or power demand, whereas we've had a bit of an increase at the more towards at what would be the end of the day. So there has been some effect on the electricity demand, obviously, but maybe something which has switched back more or less after as lockdown is taken away and as we move back from telework. Just to note that, like some areas of Europe, for example, which have a high incidence of a high proportion of renewable energy, we also see increasing periods of negative prices in the national energy market. So this is something which is sort of obviously concerning, particularly for those producers who are running gas and coal-fired power stations. I should just add, there's no nuclear power in Australia; it's illegal. But again, so periods which obviously, as you can see when we look at the accounting for the period, the time of the day, obviously an impact of renewable energy, notably solar. So that's been increasing over time. It's not totally because of the pandemic, but of course the balance of demand and supply mean that if there's not enough demand, then that supply is going to be at potentially overly, over what's needed. We've also seen an impact, of course, on petroleum products. The main way to get between states in Australia is by plane, and that's basically been cut down quite significantly. The main way to get to work for many people is by car, and that's also been reduced because of telework. Now, there are a few other things, and I'm going to skip through these slides a bit. So when we look at some of the other domestic trends, again, in terms of coal, there has been, so while coal has had declining prices internationally, renewables have been driving lower prices for electricity in many places. Again, there's this preponderance of daytime solar cutting down the affordability or the revenue for coal power plants. Many of the coal power plants have therefore been reduced in their capacity factors. And for example, there's been I think it was Australia's newest coal-fired power station has basically been written off as worthless because of the amount of renewables. Similar things happening across the world. I think this particular coal-fired power plant is one that's owned by a consortium from Japan. At the same time, we have ongoing anti-coal mining protests. So not physical protests at the moment so much, but there's a dynamic between those who would like coal mining to happen, which of course coal mining companies, but also a strong part of the current government, versus those, some of them farmers, some of them environmentalists who prefer that coal does not go ahead. And so this is in some ways, in some cases affected it's actually stopped coal mines being developed. Moreover, if we look at export trends then, so one of the most predominant factors, again, Australia transports a lot of its, or exports a lot of its coal. And so an important aspect of this is that we also export a lot of our coal to China. And so Australia sort of was pushing for an investigation into the COVID-19 origins, and China's dealing with it, but has also had a long-running sort of dispute on a variety of different trade-related issues. So towards the end, around about September, October last year, China put an unofficial ban on coal imports from Australia, which has then become an official ban. And so apart from metallurgical coal for steel, so thermal coal is basically, Australian thermal coal has not been able to be exported to China. But much of that is just going to go to somewhere else rather than China. But China, you know, again, is a large trading partner. You can see that in terms of export volumes, we've declined. There's been a significant decline. Well, 7 or 5% for metallurgical and thermal coal, respectively. In terms of value, though, because of the export prices, that has significantly declined quite a lot more. So what are we expecting in the long term? So there are trends away from coal to be expected globally, of course, and of course for Australia as an exporting country, the global trends as well as the local trends are quite significant. And Australia, as you can see, a couple of headlines here, you know, not being we can't ignore this move away from coal. In response to the pandemic, the government has put forward a variety of different measures for the budget for investing in energy, particularly. So investment, you can see that ultimately around about 0.8% of investment over the next 4 years is expected to be in energy. In things like investing in new energy technologies, which is not just renewables, and with the current government, it's not much in renewables. It's more CCS and maybe some high efficiency fossil fuel technologies. This point about gas-fired recovery is about extracting more gas and selling more gas. But it's not just the government suggesting this. So there are a lot of suggestions that we should be having some sort of a green recovery, building jobs and more clean infrastructure. And that is just really following on a trend from the past where we've had a lot more installation of solar and wind. At the moment, one of the issues in Australia is really the connection of those to the grid, which is becoming whether we have enough grid connection or connectivity to be able to make that happen. But of course, hydrogen has been exciting. Again, started up the interest, or the interest has been restarted since around about I think in around about 2018, there was a big introduction of a new hydrogen strategy. 2018 or 2019, the government did quite a number of different studies. In Queensland, they now have a hydrogen department in the government. During this period of the pandemic in particular, there's been a couple of announcements of companies saying that they're going to manufacture hydrogen vehicles, or they're going to this announcement of a domestic hydrogen battery, which is basically an electrolyzer fixed to a metal hydride storage system, or mining companies telling us that green steel and hydrogen are going to be the way of the future. So again, there's a lot of hype on hydrogen at the moment, and the government is certainly trying to, well, these things are reaching the ears of the government, and the government is putting some investment into it. Just jump through the last couple of slides. I just wanted to highlight one project, which is, again, Australia the focus on hydrogen in Australia is largely about export. It's a substitute for things like our coal and gas industry. And one project which is sort of interest, there's this Australian or Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which is planned, you can see on the map up here in sort of a remote part of the west of Australia. This was going to have a long undersea pipeline, undersea cable to produce electricity to supply to Singapore. But instead of that, they've decided to export hydrogen and ammonia. And that should, if the project moves ahead, it would be starting up in around about 5 to 10 years' time. Final point is just that the energy, there's also another focus on critical minerals. So similar to the US, the Australian government is trying to sell our critical minerals and also maintain our domestic supply. I'll finish up at that point and just leave it on this slide of conclusions. Apologies for going over time a bit, but welcome to have questions now or afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor McClellan. So I encourage, and here come the first questions. Question also by Takao Misutani. I was surprised to see such big numbers of black brown coal for generation and export in Australia. As you know, big trading firms such as Mitsui and Mitsubishi have been withdrawing their money from coal mining projects in Australia. I wonder if the government of Australia would have any plan to reduce such coal generation and export of coal to other countries in the future. In other words, any energy mix number in 2050?
In 2050, I'm not 100% sure on the current energy mix number for 2050. The current government is very conservative. I would say backwards, in that they really haven't got a high ambition for changing the energy mix. The current targets for 2030 are a reduction of about 28%, 26 to 28% on I forget what levels, but it's not particularly ambitious, and it's likely that Australia will achieve more than that. Regarding coal, yes, coal mining and investment in coal mining has been an issue in Australia. There was a very notable coal mine which was the Adani coal mine, which was going to be an enormous coal mine in Queensland, which had a lot of protest against it. It eventually got accepted, but even then they're finding an enormous problem in trying to get funding. They can't get funding from anywhere. So they have to self-fund this mine. And so it's, yeah, there are big problems with the coal mining component. Also, as mentioned on the generation side, there are problems with affordability or with capacity factors. So most old Australian coal-fired power plants are not very efficient. We still have a lot of subcritical coal-fired power plants. So the average efficiency is quite low. But again, with the influx of more renewables, that they're becoming less and less competitive or less and less affordable. So that's, again, an issue. But the problem is for Australia that we have again a large dependence on export of commodities like coal, and so there are what, tens of thousands of jobs in people mining coal, and as you could see from those export figures, more than 50% of coal is exported. So there are arguments to say, well, we could decrease our domestic usage of coal, but still export coal. But then there's also the argument that is that setting a good example? And at the same time, there are our international trading partners who are also reducing their consumption of coal or planning to. So on all of those factors, it would seem that coal mining has a certain lifetime. It's not going to be shut down in the next 5 years, but will there be many more mines accepted or licensed is a big question. Some mines have been stopped because of their impact on farmland or on water. But recently, I think last year or the year before, there was one mine in particular was banned because of its potential climate change impacts. So we are seeing this backlash against coal, particularly as renewables become quite affordable. But there's also this real question of what are the socioeconomic impacts of shutting down coal mines or shutting down the power stations, and how do we, what do we substitute for?
Just to put it into context, do you have a number for the share of the GDP of the exporting of coal and gas?
I do. I'll try and pull that up briefly if I can find it. Where is it? I was looking at this yesterday. Just a moment, sorry. Quarterly. Not that one. I'm not going to be able to pull that up straight away. But it was quite significant. It's often linked in with or mixed in with the, here we go, I think this would work. The contribution of minerals as a, here we go, yeah.
In the meantime,
Yeah.
Dr. Jill Engel-Cox has raised her hand. So, yeah.
Sure, I just had a quick question. Actually, I have several questions, but since we're short on time, I'll. At some point, I would love to hear your opinion on South Australia, and you know, we hear a lot of stories about how their renewables have caused a lot of potentially caused instability in the network. So at some point, that would be an interesting question, but perhaps a different one that I'm interested in is you seem to be your lockdown was shorter, a little bit more sporadic than ours. And the big question we're having here in the US is how long do we think the societal impacts are going to last? Are people going to be working from home more? Are we going to have less office space? Do you have any sense of if the impact was long lasting in Australia? Are people commuting less? Are people working from home more? Or did pretty much everybody's way of life return to normal or close to, or is expected to return to normal?
It's a good question. Again, not physically being there. I don't have sort of an empirical view of what's happening. But from what I have seen and read and looked at from the data, there's been a very large impact, particularly on those. We have a large sector of the economy, which is sort of gig economy, and so you've got a large impact, particularly on unemployment of young people in their ages 20 to 29 who weren't permanent workers. I imagine that sort of work will come back eventually, but that's the sort of work which is obviously not teleworkable, I guess, most of it. So I'm not 100% sure how these things will continue. I mean, I think as we probably all know from this experience, that there are certain things which are much easier to do face to face than by Zoom, and so I imagine that those things will creep back into life. But the cut down on commuting times, particularly in a place like Australia, which is big, spread out, and often reliant on private transport rather than public transport, I would think that those sort of aspects would, you know, when people start coming back to work and thinking, hey, I don't want to be making this 1.5 or 2 hour drive each way anymore. I think those things will probably start to tick over into more telework. But really, I mean, I think if this goes on for another year, then those things will probably become more permanent.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, if we had time, I'd be curious what it might be in Japan, if you're seeing any change in work life styles.
Well, we finally got to do teleworking. Yeah, but it's crazy for teaching.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's time to move on to the next session, and we are starting the 1-minute presentations by I²CNER young researchers. And in this session, young faculty of I²CNER will give 1-minute presentations describing their best research effort and its impact on technology development. It is recorded in advance, and I hope you enjoy.
My name is Takeshi Atabe from Advanced Energy Materials Class. In this short presentation, I'd like to talk about the nickel iron catalysts that provide 3 different hydrogenous models. Last year, we have reported a novel nickel iron catalyst that react with hydrogen and water to produce 3 kinds of the hydride isomers. These isomers are model for the nickel iron, iron, and iron hydrogenous model. Because the core structure of each hydride are similar to each hydrogenous, and their relative catalytic efficiencies follow the same pattern as the efficiencies of their natural analogs. The accomplishment of our objective is that this is the first example of the catalytic electron transport substrate with an equal complex by using H2 as electron source in water. Thank you.
I'm Hung from Overlap. My research project is bio-inspired molecular catalysts for energy generations. In my research, we discovered a new type of bacteria called O77, which contain phycobilizome at its major light harvesting complex. The O77 phycobilizome is mainly constructed by C-phycocyanine or CPC, an important light harvesting component thanks to its quarterly applications. I successfully purified the CPC from O77 and isolated its subunit, alpha and beta subunit. Furthermore, for the first time, crystals of subunits were obtained. The protein structures and energy transfer pathway are being determined. In my futures, based on the study of CPC structures and mechanisms, I would like to construct a new hybrid photosynthesis system for CO2 fixation and water oxidation, utilizing C-phycocyanine. Thank you.
I am Tomohiro Noguchi, a postdoctoral researcher with Yamachi Laboratory in I²CNER. Our laboratory aims to develop novel nanocatalysts for hydrogenation, and we also edited their mechanism. As you know, ammonia is an energy carrier. Leucine is a catalyst for ammonia synthesis. However, pure leucine catalyst has poisoning problems for hydrogen. Leucine iron nanoalloy catalysts can overcome hydrogen poisoning. To understand the mechanism, we use modulation excitation infrared spectroscopy. This method can detect high sensitivity, and only our laboratory can do this method in Japan. Please look at this figure. Only IR spectrum for pure leucine shows the peak at 1,863 Kaiser here. This peak is attributed to the binding of leucine and hydrogen molecules. Therefore, we consider that leucine is poisoned by hydrogen molecules bonding. Thank you for your attention.
I'm Min Han Liu. I joined Yamauchi Laboratory as a moonshot project researcher from November 2020. I'm working on copper alloy synthesis for catalyzing CO2 electron reduction. The product selectivity and efficiency of CO2 electron reduction are greatly governed by catalyst structure and catalyst composition. My short-term target is to prepare several bimetallic copper alloys with different structures such as copper nickel, copper indium, and copper leucine for highly selective methane production. And the milestone of my research is the selectivity for C1 products can reach 80%. Hopefully we can succeed soon. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tanaka from Advanced Energy Materials Trust, and the topic that I'm going to talk about is friction of coatings. DLC, diamond-like carbon coating, is one of the promising materials which shows a very low friction under hydrogen environment. But still, the mechanism for achieving low friction below 0.01 is not clear. We have investigated optimal sliding conditions for reducing friction. This figure shows that the very low friction was achieved with chromium doped DLC, while a normal DLC didn't show. That means suitable metal element is necessary for reducing friction. We believe catalytic activity of metal may be the key on this phenomenon. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone, my name is Ryosuke Komoda. I belong to Advanced Energy Materials Trust. I study the effect of ammonia in hydrogen gas on hydrogen-assisted cracking. The ammonia is one of the candidates for hydrogen storage and transport medium. However, there's a lack of knowledge of the effect of ammonia on the material strength property, especially the presence of hydrogen. In this study, I did fracture tests like this, and I obtained the crack extension behavior under load in the presence of hydrogen and ammonia. This is the result. Hydrogen-assisted cracking occur in hydrogen gas was mitigated by the addition of ammonia to the hydrogen gas. On the other hand, ammonia itself causes hydrogen embrittlement by supplying the hydrogen by its decomposition. So ammonia have both mitigation and induction effect on the hydrogen-assisted fracture. The future direction with this study is to quantify the effect of ammonia in concerted effort with the theoretical analysis. That's all. Thank you.
I'm Daisuke Takazaki at Advanced Energy Materials Trust. My research is degradation of material in high temperature hydrogen. The objective is to ensure safety of advanced energy technologies that operate at high temperature. We firstly established a testing method that enables creep test in hydrogen at 600 degrees Celsius. This graph shows the result of creep testing of the SES304 austenitic stainless steel. Hydrogen drastically reduced the creep life compared to that in argon. In argon, intergranular cracking was prevalent on the fracture surface. On the other hand, dimple fracture surface was dominant in hydrogen. The plausible mechanism that we considered is enhancement of dislocation crime mediated by increased vacancy density by hydrogen. For future direction, we will investigate further mechanism and the effect of temperature, hydrogen gas pressure, and materials. That's all. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me introduce myself. My name is Yurika Nakano. I engaged to novel photoenergy conversion systems for artificial photosynthesis on peaks. To achieve this goal, I combine photoenergy conversion systems based on peaks with ruthenium complexes. You can see larger photovoltage with kappa nanoparticles. It was suggested that the peaks occurs at the interface between the kappa nanoparticles and the p-type semiconductor nickel oxide, and it will lead to designs of the kappa-based plasmonic cells. In the future plan, I will combine ruthenium complexes with the system for water oxidation and CO2 reduction. Thank you for your listening.
Hi everyone, my name is Quentin Wu. I'm from Advanced Energy Conversion System Source. I and my co-worker are working on designing highly efficient solid oxide electrodes for CO2 and steam co-electrolysis. This work is fit in the Project 1 solid oxide cells for power and fuel production. One of the main issues for co-electrolysis is the electrochemical performance is still insufficient. So new material is needed. Recently, we have developed a new type of material having self-absorbed nanoparticle decorated on the electrode surface, which can highly improve the electrochemical performance. And the future direction is to understand the mechanism behind.
Hello, my name is Dino Klotz from the Advanced Energy Conversion System Trust, and I want to talk about photo-enhanced ionic conductivity across grain boundaries. Ionic conductivity is important for every electrolyte, and electrolyte is a central part of every fuel cell, electrolyzer, or battery, and that's why it's the focus of projects 1 and 3 of our Thrust's roadmap, with the objectives to gain better insights and improve the materials for better performance and efficiency. If we look into technical materials, and they are polycrystalline, and they usually come with grain boundary barriers that still lead to quite high resistance values. In this project, we have found a way to use light above the band gap to decrease significantly this resistance. So we can decrease the resistance, but we can also probe the electronic structure of our grain boundaries by light, and the possibility to control the ionic conductivity by light opens up a whole new range of applications. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Gambato, working under the supervision of Professor Matsushima and Adachi. In this project, our objective is to fabricate highly efficient and stable electronic devices. One of the main roadblocks is ion migration and defect induced instability in perovskite, and especially surface negative charge that electron transporting layer side is one reason to make ion stabilization at the interface, and therefore we deactivated this surface negative charge by using self-summed monolayers consisting of fully run derivatives. As a result, we were able to avoid ion stabilization at this interface, and we were able to achieve one of the most stable Chomsky devices in the literature. And the main accomplishment was the improvement of operational stability. In the future, we will focus on the defect preservation for the purpose of over 24% efficient Chomsky solar cells. Thank you.
This is Jing Wang from Advanced Energy Conversion Systems Thrust, and this research is on the wetting dynamics of droplets with phase change. And especially it is based on a background of condensation and vapor absorption in a wide range of power plants. In this research, we established a reliable and powerful numerical model to simulate the droplet dynamics and the phase change heat transfer during condensation and vapor absorption. And this is further verified with our contrast experiments. The research fully reveals the dominating mechanisms, including capillary effect, thermomalongoni, and sloto-malongoni effect during the droplet phase change, which will contribute to the rational design of functional surfaces and working fluids for enhanced thermal efficiency in a wide range of energy systems.
Hello, everyone. My name is Huan Li, and now I'm working in Advanced Energy Conversion Systems as a postdoc. My research mainly focuses on new concept batteries with high capacity and Coulombic efficiency. During the development of aqueous dual carbon battery, the roadblock are the water electrolysis and the narrow electrochemical stability window of less than 2 watts. Now we have developed a kind of high concentration water in bi-salt electrolyte. By using this kind of electrolyte, a broadened electrochemical stability window of 3.1 can be obtained, as well as inhibited water electrolysis. In the future work, we will also focus on the improvement of the Coulombic efficiency for the aqueous dual carbon battery.
Konnichiwa. This is Daniel Orejon, lecturer at the University of Edinburgh and visiting associate professor at I²CNER. Today, I bring you a fourth avenue to superhydrophobicity developed in this international collaboration, which is owed to the fine-tuned uncouple of surface, micro and nanostructure on metallic surfaces and exposure to volatile organic compounds ever present in the ambient. These surfaces are able to transition from hydrophilic to superhydrophobic, and more importantly, they are able to perform in a dropwise condensation fashion without the need for typical hydrophobic coatings that are not durable and stable in time. These surfaces have direct implications on everyday life and industrial applications such as power generation, air conditioning, and refrigeration related applications. Thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, my name is Nguyen Huang. I'm doing an interdisciplinary research project under collaborations with other professors across different trusts in I²CNER. Today, I talk about one of our results on the decentralized peer-to-peer mechanisms for direct electricity trading between residential prosumers equipped with fuel cell combined heat and power unit, whose operations is illustrated in this diagram. The simulation result shown in this figure using realistic data for 6 houses demonstrate that our proposed mechanism pushes the fuel cells to operate at the maximum output so that they have enough electricity for their own house, for selling to other houses, and to minimize the electricity bought from the grid. Our research has the impact on efficient energy management for optimal integrations of renewable and distributed energy resource to the power grid, cognizance of prosumers' behavior. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, I am Kasamet Rocky from Charlotte.
I am currently working with activated carbon and ionic liquid-based composite adsorbents for the performance enhancement of adsorption heat pump. The specific target of my research is the development of activated carbon-based concentrated composite with a suitable binder, which will contribute in adsorption capacity as well as in the enhancement of packing density and thermal conductivity. Therefore, we have synthesized amino acid-based polymerized ionic liquid, which has been used as binder. And we are the first time using this ionic liquid as a binder to consolidate activated carbon. This ionic liquid-based consolidate composite exhibits higher thermal conductivity than that of parent activated carbon of type magnesium 3 and conventional binder PBA-based activated carbon composite, which is shown in the figure. Besides, ionic liquid-based composites show higher carbon dioxide and ethanol adsorption uptake than PBA-contained composite, which finally concludes ionic liquid is a promising binder. Thank you for listening.
Good morning, everybody. I am Motia Rahman from Shah Laboratory, third year doctoral student, Kyushu University, Japan. Today, I am going to talk about optimum models for IUPAC classified adsorption isotherms. Optimum adsorption isotherms have been determined using statistical approaches. At first, relevant experimental data are fitted with GRG nonlinear optimization technique and errors are calculated. Next, using statistical bootstrap approach and some statistical tests confirmed about optimum isotherms. This research will help effectively measure the performance parameters like specific cooling effect, coefficient of performance of the adsorption heat pump system, which obviously help to improve the system design. Thank you all.
Hello everyone, I am Mohua Jahan Rupa, a doctoral student from Shah Laboratory. Today I am presenting the kinetics analysis of newly synthesized composite with ethanol to thermally driven adsorption system. And this composite consists of MaxR 3, graphene nanoplates as thermal conductivity enhancer, and polyphenol alcohol as a binder. Because kinetics is an important factor for the system to understand the diffusion of adsorbate in force, and it compute the required time to complete the adsorption-desorption cycles. The measured data fit with the linear driving force and Fick and diffusion model, and composite on shows faster kinetics in comparative view. But this model cannot fit the experimental data correctly, and for this we need a new kinetics model. To build a new kinetics model, we need to study a lot for existing kinetics model, physical significance, realize very carefully. That's all. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Tahmid Hassan Rukam from Shah Laboratory. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my research progress among the elite audience of today's program. My research is focused on the fundamentals of adsorption science. As adsorption is a surface phenomenon, I have concentrated my research on characterizing the surface energy of functional adsorbent materials using the inverse gas chromatography. Our current research goal is to understand the different components of the surface energy in the adsorbent material and how they interact with the adsorbent molecules. So far, we have studied the Henry region ethanol adsorption on different high-grade activated carbons and found a linear relationship between the specific entropy and the ratio of the Henry constant to the pore volume of samples. This study has two significant findings. First, we have calculated the ideal entropy of a carbon ethanol-based adsorption system. Secondly, and the most important one, we have predicted that a newly synthesized carbonaceous adsorbent having a Kh by Vp value within the range of 0 to 15 kg per kilojoule would possess a higher net uptake and faster adsorption kinetics than the studied higher activated carbon samples. And our next target is to provide a similar guideline for synthesizing the optimum metal organic frameworks for water adsorptions. Thank you for your kind attention.
Good morning, everybody. I am Shaman Chandukarmukar, second year doctoral student at Shah Laboratory, I²CNER. Today, I would like to talk about the environmental taxes and technological innovation, which is the collaborative research between Shah Laboratory and Chapman Laboratory. The Chapman Laboratory is working on the energy transition and social equity. So we are collaborating for quantitative-based energy policy assessment. Here, several studies have investigated the effect of environmental taxes on economic growth and carbon emissions. However, there is a lack of literature regarding the causal relationship between environmental taxes and technological innovation. That's why we used econometric approach to assess the effect of environmental taxes on technological innovation, controlling GDP and R&D. And we found that the environmental taxes have positive effect on technological innovation, and GDP and R&D also have positive effect on innovation. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, this is Ziko Taniguchi from Platform for International Collaboration and Partnerships. I have been working on CO2 capture by membranes. I'm going to show you one of the results today. The project is to develop CO2 separation membrane modules with high CO2 separation performance for demonstration. The key is how to form a thin CO2 selective layer on a porous support. This is a cross-section of the hollow fiber developed, and you can see the formation of a thin layer. The CO2 separation performance of the membrane module like this was validated in biogas upgrading, CO2 capture over methane with this company. More than 96% CO2 concentration was confirmed in the permeate, which meant the membrane was working. The membrane module would be applicable in different CO2 separations like this. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Roman Selyanchny, representing IEEE Trust and Platform for International Collaboration and Partnership of I²CNER. We are working on development of efficient membranes for CO2 capture and diluted streams, aiming to design the membranes with high fluxes and selectivity to CO2. Recently, we discovered the phenomenon of highly selective separation driven by the thin interface formed between two polymeric layers in the structure of thin film composite membranes shown here in the TM image. We found that activity of the interface between layers conveniently controlled by oxygen plasma treatment resulted in the remarkable CO2 selectivity. Ultimate thinning of layers allowed high permeances, while interface activity provided high selectivity, reaching the values needed for post-combustion CO2 capture. Overall, we had overcome the performance of benchmark and literature-reported membranes for CO2 and nitrogen separation. We believe this new finding of nano-interface selectivity will allow the membrane technology to be widely applied to industrial and ultimately atmospheric CO2 capture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers, and thank you all for listening. So it's already time to move on to the final presentation. And Professor Robert Gross, Director of the UK Energy Research Centre and Professor of Energy Policy and Technology at Imperial College London, will give a talk titled "The UK's Net Zero Target and Economic Recovery. What are the policy and technology challenges to clean growth?" This final presentation will be delivered via a pre-recorded video due to the inconvenient time right now in the UK.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rob Gross. I'm Professor of Energy Policy and Technology at Imperial College in London. I'm also the Director of the UK Energy Research Centre. I'm going to be talking this afternoon about the UK's net zero target and some of the recent policy announcements which the UK government has made as part of what they call a green industrial revolution that's focused upon the potential of renewables, energy efficiency and low carbon technology as part of the recovery from the global COVID-19 pandemic. I've got very fond memories of my visit to the facilities at the university there. Wonderful campus, very modern and exciting facilities and opportunity to do some important fundamental research, as well as some of the whole systems modeling and economic dimensions of the net zero challenge that I'm going to be talking about. I'm trying to link those two things together in my talk this afternoon. So very many thanks to Petros and colleagues for inviting me to take part. And I'm only sorry that I can't be there in person to join the conversations. Hopefully that will be possible once the vaccines are ready and the world can begin to get back to normal next year. Okay, so very briefly, first of all, just to explain to you what UKERC actually is. UKERC's a consortium is based at UCL, University College London. It includes many of the UK's leading universities, and I'll explain a bit more about that on the next slide. And we have a interlocking, hence the jigsaw puzzle graphic, research program that spans many dimensions of the net zero clean energy transition challenge. So that includes energy for mobility or transport, infrastructure transitions, heat and cooling decarbonisation, industrial decarbonisation, the impacts on the wider environment, so not just carbon, but other environmental impacts, regional aspects and local energy issues, as well as the global geopolitics. And we've got a whole bunch of policy-facing functions and research activities as well. As you can see from this map, the consortium includes many of the leading UK universities. We're also very keen to link internationally, and in fact, we act as one of the key contact points for research across the UK with our international partners. So just to explain the rationale for my talk, in many respects, the UK has been a leader over a number of years, at least for more than a decade now, in climate policy development. In 2008, we set out targets for 2050 in a Climate Change Act. That's a legally binding obligation on the UK government to progressively reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. Initially, the targets were set at 60%. That was increased to 80% on a 1990 baseline. And now, just in early 2019, the British government signed into force a net zero target for 2050. As I'll explain as we go through the talk, greenhouse gas emissions are already down more than 40%, but that's in large part down to a combination of energy efficiency and switching away from coal to renewables and gas in the electricity generation sector. There's also been a whole host of new announcements made by the British Prime Minister and others, for example, to increase fourfold to 40 gigawatts the installed capacity of offshore wind, and a ban on the sale of non-plug-in petrol and diesel powered private cars, automobiles, in 2030. We're hosting in Britain, in Scotland, in fact, the climate change negotiations later this year, known as the Conference of the Parties, or COP. Now, unfortunately, perhaps, the UK has now left the European Union, but I think that the UK provides quite an interesting case study of some of the challenges that we'll face. And the aspirations for carbon abatement are very similar across our near neighbours and partners in the EU. We're already hearing ambitious plans from President Biden, and Japan, of course, has its own low carbon decarbonisation aspirations. And we're seeing increasingly ambitious targets set by many countries now around the world. So I'm going to look at what lessons we might learn from what I'm describing as the British case study. So just a very brief few slides now on some of the policy context. So in the spring of 2019, Britain's Climate Change Committee, which advises the government and sets the targets, for the interim targets for carbon reduction, made a recommendation that our aspiration ought to be, in the light of the Paris Agreement, the aspiration to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, that UK emissions goals should be increased from 80% reduction on 1990 levels to net zero. And it was the first major economy in the world to pass a net zero emissions law. More recently, during the course of 2020, a number of new policy commitments were made. For example, a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. Those are the government's words, not mine. Focused on, in particular, growing offshore wind, but also doing a number of exciting things across other sectors, as I'll explain. with an aspiration to lead the world and to gain economic benefit from decarbonisation technologies and industries that are associated with that. So I'm not going to run through all of this 10-point plan. The detail I'll leave for you to read from the slide or to look up through the link that I've provided. But there's a number of standout things here that have been promised. I've already mentioned offshore wind, and there's going to be expansion of onshore wind and solar as well. Aspirations for hydrogen. Now, the role of hydrogen in the decarbonised energy system of the future is actually a really, really important research topic, in my view, in its own right. However, there's an aspiration to work with industry to produce low carbon hydrogen and then to use that in a range of applications. There's an aspiration to continue to advance new nuclear as a low carbon source. Somewhat controversially, in some countries, of course, nuclear is off the table and is not one of the options that countries still wish to pursue, but that's not the case in the UK. There's a plan to increase the role of electric vehicles, to work on green aviation. CCS, carbon capture and storage, is also an important element of this plan, together with energy efficiency. Innovation and finance, I'll come back to. And of course, it's also important to bear in mind that what we're talking about in the symposium this afternoon is very much the changes to the energy system, but that is largely addressing the sources of CO2. What we can also take action on is the stocks and sinks for carbon. So that's what's described as nature-based solutions, afforestation, and increasing the capacity of soils to absorb CO2 as well. That 10-point plan was launched last autumn, and just more recently, just before Christmas, that was followed up with an energy white paper. And that provides more detail on some of the things that the UK wants to do in order to deliver on our low carbon aspiration. There's a few things I'll highlight additional to what I've mentioned already. So the first is an industrial clusters mission, 4 low carbon clusters by 2030. So the aspiration there is to look for opportunities for CCS, for example, on the northeast coast of the United Kingdom, where there's potential for CCS in depleted oil and gas fields, and where there's also a number of process industries that could be converted to hydrogen, or which could use fossil fuels with carbon capture. We're going to create a UK-specific emissions trading scheme with the aspiration that will be linked to other schemes. There's a few things here that I think are potentially quite groundbreaking. So, for example, ending the connection of domestic properties to gas for heating, expanding the role of heat pumps, attention to digitalisation, as well as a number of more detailed things that I won't go into now that were around the electricity market and the consumer proposition that we might find in a decarbonised world. So I think the first thing, just in terms of the longer term context, is that from 1990, we've already seen a significant decarbonisation in the UK, 42% emissions reduction by 2018 or so, whilst at least obviously we've had huge impacts on GDP in the last year, but prior to that, an almost 70% increase in GDP. And that speaks to a significant what's called reduction in the energy and carbon ratios. So that's the amount of emissions per unit of GDP produced. Particularly notable is the extent to which electricity generation has seen emissions reduction. So you can see on the graph there specific emissions. So that's grams per kilowatt hour per unit of electricity generated have approximately halved. And on the right-hand side, you can see emissions from all sectors, but in particular, the line that's coming down most significantly there, the power sector line, showing the most significant reductions in emissions overall. And this story is expanded on in the slides that you can see in front of you now. And what you can see, I think, most strikingly in that left-hand graphic is how we've moved from a power system that was predominantly coal, and as recently as 1990 was a mix of coal and nuclear, to a rising share of renewables and an increasing share of gas, with coal now planned to be scrapped in the UK generation mix by 2025, and already down to just less than 5% of electricity generation. You can see the death of coal illustrated more dramatically in that slide. All of this, a lot of this slide information is from something called Electric Insights, which is produced by my colleagues at Imperial College, taking data from the electricity market and providing a real-time picture of emissions and electricity prices and so on. I've already mentioned also the expansion of renewables. And if you look back to 2000, renewables accounted for a very small share. New renewables less than 1%. Those new renewables like wind and solar are now standing at something around 20% of electricity. Renewables are up to nearly 40% of electricity overall, and low carbon now, including nuclear, accounts for more than half of the British electricity generation mix. As we look forward, one of the most striking factors of the scenarios that have been developed for continuing decarbonisation is the volume of investment that will be required to move towards net zero. The graph takes data from the British Government Department of Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BEIS, which shows the big blue chunk in the middle of that triangle is the expansion of renewables capacity in particular. We also see a role for new nuclear, and looking out to the longer term, a role for carbon capture and storage. And if you place that kind of low carbon electricity generation capacity in an historical context, now this is not a UKIP or a UK government slide. This is data from Carbon Brief, a publication, and from the consultancy Atkins. But on the left-hand side here, you can see some of the historical expansion of coal here in the 1960s, some nuclear stations during the 70s and 80s. This is the dash for gas, as we call it, growth of gas-fired generation. These are the new renewables. And this is something like the capacity expansion that we would need year on year if we're to achieve our net zero aspirations. And one of the reasons for that is that we don't just need to continue to decarbonize the current supply of electricity, but we also need to expand the supply of electricity overall. Scenarios recently developed, analysis recently provided by the UK's Climate Change Committee suggests that we're likely to need to double the share of electricity, double the volume of electricity generated, so that we can increase the share of electricity in end-use sectors such as the provision of domestic heating and transport, primarily through the electrification of private cars. So a really, really, really significant challenge to achieve these net zero aspirations. So I've got a slide here that's taken from I2CNER, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and that tells a similar story on a global scale. So I think there's a big global opportunity to build on this this experience in the UK and a number of other countries in terms of reducing the use of coal and expanding the use of renewables. But that aspect of the story is really only just this bit at the top. What we're also going to need to do is to transform the remainder of our energy system so that we're using electricity, decarbonized electricity in new sectors. And in some respects, therefore, this power sector decarbonisation is not an easy thing to achieve by any means. It's extremely ambitious, but it might even prove to be the easiest step on this journey. Now, in order to illustrate that, I've used the graph that you can see in front of me, produced by a very good colleague, Grant Wilson, who's at Birmingham University in the UK. So the red line that you can see here, this is over the course of a number of years, and it's showing the gigawatt hours of energy used in different sectors on a daily basis. The red line is the fluctuations in the power sector. This the line here shows what's happening in the transport sector relatively, both of these being not in any way stable. Bearing in mind this is a fairly significant jump here on the red line in particular, but much less variable than the use of natural gas. That natural gas demand is primarily used in, well, it's used in power generation, but it's also primarily, and industry, but it's also used very significantly to provide heating for buildings. And so you see this very pronounced interseasonal energy demand swing. The challenge, therefore, if we're to move away from molecules easily stored fossil fuels in solid, liquid or gaseous form to electricity, to the flow of electrons, then we have a challenge in providing the flexibility that we have taken for granted in meeting these kind of swings that you can see here on a daily or interseasonal basis in a new way. And I think that gives rise to some of the science and engineering challenges, first of all, that we face on the journey to decarbonisation. So the first question that we have is what will provide the flexibility that we need? And if we're to move to an electricity system that has a large share of renewables, what will provide the interseasonal storage that we may find that we need in some parts of the world? And I'm thinking in particular about the potential to have a perhaps very cheap solar, but highly variable solar in terms of the seasonal variation in the outputs, particularly as we move away from the equator. And rather obviously, as I sit here, looking at the clouds that have come across on what was a sunny day in January, just outside London. Now we know already, and we're seeing increasing experience around the world with the use of batteries, grid-connected batteries, for example, to provide very fast frequency response, to replace the reduction in rotating mass and inertia that we're experiencing as we move in some countries towards much larger shares of asynchronous generation and renewables. And we also know that they can provide in-day storage, perhaps several hours, and that might work very effectively in sunnier climates, for example, with a large contribution from solar, but it's very unlikely to provide that interseasonal buffer that we think might be necessary. And so there's a question, well, what will provide that? Where could we look to provide that? It might be synthetic fuels. It could also be the bulk storage of hydrogen. And that's certainly something which is a research need to understand the economics and the potential for that. Continuing with my theme of thinking about hydrogen, obviously it's possible to burn hydrogen in power stations. It's also possible to use electrolyzers to manufacture hydrogen from surplus renewables when, for example, it's very windy and the demand is low. But that's not necessarily a particularly cost-effective use for hydrogen, and also has a fairly hefty efficiency penalty. So there's a question then, I think, about what the best use of hydrogen might be in a number of different sectors. There's an international debate about the role of green hydrogen from renewables or blue hydrogen from carbon capture and storage. But it seems clear that for a number of industrial sectors, that carbon capture and hydrogen appear to be the main options for decarbonisation. So if we're serious about net zero, then I think that we need to explore everything that's associated with both, all of the upstream issues that are associated with CCS. So that's capture efficiency, and that is the storage sites that we're going to need, but also the kind of downstream issues in delivering a decarbonised energy vector, which could be, of course, electricity, could also be hydrogen, in order to move that into a number of industrial sectors. I think there's also questions, I've mentioned electrification of transport. Often that conversation is focused upon domestic, Teslas, electric cars and so on. But what about heavy vehicles, trucks? What about shipping and aviation? And here again, there's a number of different options in play and important conversations to be had. Now, whether that's about manufacturing synthetic hydrocarbons, whether that's about taking the hydrogen and associating it with nitrogen, so that we could use ammonia. And fuel cell research has been something which has been in the conversation for the whole time that I've been working in energy, which is about 25 years or so now. So will fuel cell technology finally achieve that mass market, that widespread utilization that's been envisaged and imagined for such a long time, for example, in the trucking sector? Now that's very much kind of technological view of the world. I'm not going to try and delve into the kind of technological specifics or the primary research needs of that too much, but there's also a whole range of market-related questions, and I've just introduced one of them on this slide, which is that thinking about whether or not actually we move from a world where many of our fossil fuel sources, particularly oil and coal, are globally traded commodities, and in the form of liquefied natural gas also increasingly globally traded and certainly regionally traded through pipelines. So what will be the role for very large, long distance, perhaps very high voltage or superconducting transmission of electricity? Will we see bulk hydrogen carriers in the same way that we now have liquefied natural gas and oil carriers? These are all extremely important questions to be addressed. And what I've tried to do in this slide is to map across just a few of those thoughts to the research program that I know is being taken forward by colleagues over there. So I've taken your three main themes, and apologies for my rather incompetent slide drawing skills, but you can see how I've tried to map across some of those questions that I've raised in the slide to some of the fundamental research challenges that I know that you're grappling with. And also the system modeling dimension. I think there's hugely important questions of optimization. One of the things that we learn all the time repeatedly is that whatever projections we make will always turn out for one reason or another to be wrong. But that doesn't invalidate the effort of representing the energy system in a model, considering the options that we know that we have available to us, and thinking through the strategies that governments will need to put in place to transform the energy system and to develop new infrastructure. So I'm not going to try and answer any of those questions. I just want to put into the conversation that we need to think through that relationship between primary research needs and the challenges that lie in front of us as we move towards an increasingly decarbonised world. I've almost finished, but I also wanted to make the observation that many of the challenges that we face are not just about engineering and technology, but they're also about people and about a whole system transformation and about society more widely. So we need to bring the investment community along with us if we are to sustain growth in renewables and create the investment that will need to come in, for example, to CCS pipelines or new nuclear. And that's a challenge for policymakers. In the past, renewables growth was driven mainly by subsidies. We're now in a world where renewables increasingly are, on a levelized cost basis, cost competitive with conventional options for providing electricity, but that doesn't mean that they have the same investment characteristics. So there's a need to provide the investment climate that's adequate to unlock the potential that might be there, for example, in global pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. There's a huge amount of opportunity to tap into the potential for investment in low carbon options. That really links back into this whole story about COVID, because that's where the kind of growth potential will flow. But that means that we need the kind of right investment climate and the right policies to support that. And that's a policy challenge, because policy needs to stay the course. This is not something that can be put in place for 2 years, 5 years, or even 10 years. This is a multi-decadal challenge. It's largely an infrastructure challenge. Improving the building stock across numerous countries is going to offer the potential for warmer and more comfortable, or cooler in some climates, but more comfortable homes, potential to create hundreds of thousands of jobs even in individual countries and millions of jobs internationally. It's an infrastructural transformation as we move towards away from conventional fossil fuels. A huge opportunity, but the policy community needs to get behind that. And it needs perhaps a bit of a mindset shift away from short-term thinking and the next election towards a multi-decadal transformation. And that means institutions need to be created that stay the course. There's also a challenge for consumers. The simplest way of characterizing this is that they need to adopt new technologies. So I need to get on with it and buy the electric vehicle that I keep dreaming about and looking up on various websites. Or we might need to replace, the next time a gas boiler is replaced, replace it with a heat pump. That's a technological change. That's a consumer challenge in itself. But actually there's some more far-reaching and wide-ranging changes that people might need to make in their lifestyles. We know that if we eat less meat and have a more plant-based diet, we can reduce particularly methane emissions. And we know, I mean, COVID has massively affected travel patterns. That's why I'm not with the organizers of this event in Japan. What will happen in the long term, and how can we move towards the mobility that we desire, but in a more sustainable way. And there's a whole set of whole system challenges. We know that renewables have the potential to be relatively cheap now. They've come down in price so much. But how do we integrate them into a system at much larger volumes than we've done previously? What are we going to do with hydrogen, as I've already said? How can we access demand response? So can we have smart consumers with clever digital interfaces, charging or even discharging their electric vehicles in response to the system needs as we move to electrified cooling, heating, and road transport? So many things there to consider. Very ambitious policy goals set out by the UK. A considerable amount of progress has already been made by the UK. The UK government has said very clearly that it sees the green industrial revolution, as it describes it, as being a key opportunity in the COVID-19 recovery space. I very much hope that that is followed through, and that turns out to come true and to be a real thing. After the financial crisis in 2008, many governments made some green promises that perhaps were not fully delivered upon. So we have to hope that that does come to pass. And if it does, it creates an immense opportunity for us as scientists, engineers and researchers to think about that relationship between the fundamental science and the policy needs for decarbonising our energy system. I will leave it there. Enjoy the rest of your symposium, the afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute.
Okay, thanks go to Professor Gross to deliver this, this talk. To close the symposium, we will have a wrap-up session now, led by Professor Andrew Chapman. So, Professor Chapman, please.
Wondering, can you see my screen okay? All okay?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. So I was asked to wrap up this session, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew. I work in the energy analysis part of the multi-scale science for science and engineering for energy and the environment section of I²CNER, which really brings together all of the concepts that we've talked about today in engendering this transition. So I'd just like to make a few points to wrap up the session for today. First of all, I would like to thank all the presenters and participants, beginning with Professor Ishibashi, Professor Kuroki, Director Sophronis, Mr. Matsuda from METI, Mr. Matsken-Bridger from the DOE, Dr. Engel Cox from NREL, Professor McClellan from Kyoto University and UQ, all of our young presenters in the 1-minute session, and of course our most recent presenter, Professor Gross from the UK Energy Research Centre and Imperial College. I think you'll agree we had a broad range of presenters from Japan, the US, Australia and Europe, giving us a good sort of broad overview of how these different regions and some specific countries are dealing with re-energizing their economies and energy systems post-COVID-19 and what that looks like for them. Today's topic, I particularly like the title, A Virtuous Cycle, Embedding the Energy Transition in Post-COVID-19 Recovery. I think we just need to step back and look at those two concepts, abstract from each other. And we know that the energy transition describes a process by which we change our current, mostly fossil-based energy system, although changing very rapidly, toward a cleaner, fairer, carbon-neutral energy system. And I think we can all understand and visualize that quite easily. But I wanted to focus a bit on, what is a virtuous cycle? We hear about, vicious cycles and the opposite kind of a concept. But a virtuous cycle is not just one event. It's not just one cycle of the wheel. It's a series of events, a series of changes that then reinforce each other. And as we go through each iteration, the benefits are compounded and we build on those benefits. So I think these two concepts working together are really good. And I think we can summarize them a little bit as learning, innovating, and then transitioning. I think that really describes I²CNER's mission and our broader partners' mission in meeting these two challenges and these two concepts. I think as I watched the presentations and as I learned some of the new directions and different challenges that face us in different parts of the world, that we were able to reconfirm some key concepts that will guide our future research and collaborative efforts. The first among them is that this challenge that we face, climate change or the engendering of a carbon neutral future, is the primary challenge of our time. There is no bigger challenge at the moment. And we think post-COVID that it's a similar challenge in that it's a global challenge and that it requires cooperation between nations, between leaders, between policymakers to achieve. And I think that was well stated in all of our presentations today. I think we also need to understand that there are many ways to achieve a carbon neutral future. They could include things like hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, nuclear and renewables, among others. There's no one size fits all. So we need to match the technologies and the scale for the different regions. I think we can all agree, and I think there was an undercurrent in all of the presentations that said COVID-19 has been devastating in terms of the lives that we lost and also the disruption to international cooperation and even just something as simple as our daily lives. On the flip side, when we try and draw positives out of a negative experience, what we have found that CO2 was reduced as a result. We stopped moving as much, we stopped interacting as much, industry declined, economies declined, and as a result, CO2 also reduced. So I guess my biggest question, and some of the research that I've been involved in, asks the question is, as we rebuild, what can we learn? Do we just uptick the economy, get back to normal and remove, repeat the mistakes of the past and enter the same CO2 trajectories? I don't think so. I think people have learned that some jobs do work better with teleworking. Some industries, do have gains that come from energy efficiencies or automation or other innovations. So I think there's still room, although we know that the economy will tick back up and CO2 as a result will increase, that there is room for us to reduce some of that. And I think Robert Gross's presentation at the end summarized what all of the presenters were saying, was that energy policy is likely to change. We're not going to be stuck on the same path. I think that the lessons of COVID will have underpinning and engendering effects on energy policy of the future. And I honestly believe that our research, all of those participating in this symposium today, is that we can influence future policy to achieve the three tenets of sustainability, which are environment, economic, and societal goals. And I think we realized under COVID that not everything is predetermined by the economy. The environment and our society are also clearly really important parts of sustainable development. So we accept that there are many challenges remaining, but I think by looking at different regions today and having different presenters, we do have a strong hope for the future. We know that in Japan, Prime Minister Suga has committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. So that's really exciting for us here in I²CNER and how we develop the technologies that underpin that. We know that, only just over about a week ago, the change in administration in the US, and then a few days later, in fact, on the day of the administration, the US recommitted to the Paris Agreement. So these, again, exciting things for our colleagues in the US, and will shape what research is prioritized and all these other things too. And then I know that in the final presentation, Robert Gross talked about the UK, which has, unfortunately or fortunately, depending where you sit on the issue, separated from the EU. But the EU, at least, is talking about the Green Deal. Not only carbon emission reduction to nothing or carbon neutrality, but also a Green Deal which leaves no one behind. Just getting back to that societal part. And also one of our key missions here at I²CNER is that the technologies, the policies, the combinations and the systems that we develop are for people. And so society is clearly going to be impacted. So I think these three things at least give us a strong hope for the future. My final slide. In spite of the challenges presented by COVID-19, our research continues and flourishes under this strong shift toward a fair carbon neutral future. And I think today, as we got together over Zoom, and I miss, a little bit of clapping or, some comments and the to and fro that comes with asking and answering questions that really builds our understanding. And, Zoom, even here as I'm sitting in this room in the economics department, talking to myself in front of a screen, I feel that we are resilient. We've learned to use these tools. We've learned to collaborate and get value, even under these difficult times. I do want to welcome everyone to Fukuoka as soon as everything is back to normal again. So not only we hope that the 2022 symposium will be in Fukuoka and you can visit us, that of course when international flying opens up for everybody, that we can start visiting and collaborating with you. Finally, I want to thank all of our presenters, distinguished guests and participants in today's symposium. And I think I²CNER, just getting back to what I was talking about before, we're innovating, we're collaborating, and in the end, we are transitioning. I just want to put up, because I think it's a great message that really centers where we're coming from. And I've stolen Director Sophronis' slide from earlier in his 2-slide introduction, that we shouldn't waste this opportunity. And I think this really demonstrates that virtuous cycle, that there are different aspects, different angles, and different things that we need to tackle and I think the top left, increasing the momentum for an energy transition. It's not going to happen overnight, but our joint efforts is what's going to get it there. So with that, I want to thank everyone today for being glued to your screens for several hours and joining us over Zoom. And now I would like to hand back to Dino. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So thank you all. This is the end of the 2021 I²CNER's Annual Symposium. I want to thank also all the attendees today. Thank you for attending. Thanks to all the speakers and thanks to everyone who has organized this event and made this possible. And final announcement, when this webinar ends, you will be leaded to a questionnaire screen. So we would like to ask you for your cooperation. Thank you for attending our symposium today.